Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. School in Ohio. It had been a typical evening, the kind where the sky turns a dull gray as night falls, and the world outside feels quiet and still. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some old research notes, when the sound of a new email notification broke the silence. A strange, unsettling chill ran through me as I opened the message. Subject: Investigation Opportunity Abandoned School in Ohio. At first, I thought it was just another one of those spam emails that tend to clog up my inbox. But there was something about the subject line that caught my attention. Something that felt different. I clicked it open. Dear Alex, we have a case that requires someone with your unique skills. An abandoned school in Ohio has been the center of strange occurrences. Our previous team members were unable to make sense of it, but we believe with your expertise, we can uncover the truth. There are reports of unsettling phenomena, whispers, shadows, and unexplained disappearances. The school has a dark history, and we need someone to investigate. Are you willing to join our team? Looking forward to your response. Name of the investigator. I sat back, staring at the screen. The email was brief, but the tone was oddly personal, as though the sender knew exactly what would grab my attention. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. An abandoned school. Whispers and shadows. Disappearances. It all sounded like the stuff of urban legends, things I have read about in books or heard from other investigators. But this felt different. It wasn't just a rumor, it was an invitation. And part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, wanted to go. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I felt an odd, creeping sense of dread settle over me. But alongside it, there was also curiosity. A hunger to know the truth. To uncover what had happened in that place. I glanced out the window at the darkening sky. The world outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. My attention was drawn entirely to the screen in front of me. I took a deep breath and began typing my response. Count me in. As soon as I hit send, I felt the weight of my decision. The chill in the air seemed to intensify, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. But it was too late. The email had already gone out. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window, staring into the night. In that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness, waiting. The next few days passed at a blur. I found myself looking at the email again and again, but each time, something in me hesitated. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned if I was making the right choice. I had never been involved in an investigation this unsettling. Sure, I had done my share of paranormal research over the years, but this felt different. Darker. More dangerous. I leaned back in my chair, trying to push away the unease that had settled in my chest. My mind wandered back to my first encounter with the supernatural, back to a small house on the outskirts of town where I had helped a family plagued by strange noises. At the time, I had been young, eager to prove myself, and I believed that any ghostly occurrence could be explained with enough research and the right equipment. But when I first heard the whispering in that house, when I felt the temperature drop and saw the dark shape move across the hallway, I realized I wasn't prepared for what lay beyond the rational explanations. After that case, I started to understand the true weight of what I was dealing with. It wasn't just about finding answers. It was about confronting things that humans weren't meant to understand. I thought I had put that part of my life behind me, but the email pulled me back in. It was as if it had been waiting for me all this time, like it knew I would eventually come back to the world I had once feared. I closed my eyes, thinking of the others, the investigators who had tried to uncover the truth about the strange events in abandoned houses, hospitals, and schools. Some of them had walked away with only their minds slightly shaken. But a few were never seen again. The stories were whispered among our circle, tales of investigators who crossed a line, who saw something they shouldn't have, and who paid the price. I thought of my mentor, Greg, who had taken me under his wing all those years ago. He always told me that there was no turning back once you opened the door to the unknown. You'll never see the world the same way again, he had warned. I had dismissed it then, but now, sitting in the dim light of my apartment, his words haunted me. I could still hear his voice in my head. Don't do it, Alex. Some doors should stay closed. But the truth was, I was already too deep. The door had already opened, and there was no going back. With a heavy sigh, I grabbed my phone and tapped out a message to the group leader, confirming my participation. Count me in. Let's see what's really happening at this school. I didn't feel the excitement I had expected. Instead, I felt a deep, gnawing uncertainty. But curiosity won out in the end. I had to know what was hiding in that place. Something told me that whatever I found, it would change everything. I set the phone down and rubbed my temples. The weight of what I was about to do seemed so much heavier now that I had made the decision. But there was no turning back. The school in Ohio was calling to me, and I couldn't ignore it. As I prepared for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was already waiting for me there, something that had been waiting a long time. The days leading up to the trip were filled with a sense of mounting tension. I found myself pacing around my apartment, gathering equipment and supplies for the investigation. A camera, voice recorders, extra batteries, a flashlight that flickered when you needed it most, essential tools for any paranormal case. But despite the routine nature of the preparations, nothing about this felt routine. There was a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking back to the email, the words that were so matter-of-fact in their description of the school's eerie history. Whispers, shadows, disappearances. It felt like I was walking into a nightmare, but the curiosity inside me refused to be extinguished. I spent the evening packing, stacking the equipment carefully into my travel bag. The more I packed, the more the weight of the situation seemed to press down on me. Was I really ready to face whatever was waiting in Ohio? I didn't know. But I felt an urgency to go, as though something was pulling me toward it, compelling me to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The morning of the trip, I met the other members of the research team at a small, nondescript diner on the edge of town. The atmosphere inside was warm, bustling with the chatter of locals, but it felt strangely distant. The air was thick with the hum of normalcy, while outside, the world felt off-kilter. I was the last to arrive. I scanned the room, spotting the team gathered at a large booth in the back. They looked as ordinary as anyone could, but there was something in their eyes that told me they weren't. I could see it in their tired stares, the subtle tension in their posture. Each one seemed to carry the weight of experience, the burden of encounters I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The leader of the group, a tall woman in her mid-30s named Sarah, stood up to greet me. She had an air of authority, her eyes sharp and calculating. She extended her hand with a firm grip. "Alex, glad you could make it. We've all heard about your work. I'm Sarah, and this," she motioned to the others, "is John, Emma, and Peter." John was the tech expert, always adjusting his glasses and muttering about equipment calibration. Emma had a quiet, almost ghostly presence. I hadn't seen her smile yet. Peter, on the other hand, had a nervous energy to him, his foot tapping constantly, as though he couldn't sit still for long. "Nice to meet you all," I said, my voice sounding oddly foreign to me. I felt out of place, but I was here now, and I had to push that feeling aside. We exchanged pleasantries before settling into the booth. As Sarah began explaining the details of the investigation, I couldn't help but notice the unease in her tone. She spoke with the authority of someone who had been through this before, but there was a subtle undercurrent of fear, something she was trying to hide. The kind of fear that only comes from knowing you're about to walk into something you can't control. "This isn't just any abandoned building," Sarah explained. "It's been standing empty for years. The locals don't even go near it. We've had several reports of strange occurrences, whispers in the halls, figures seen in windows, people hearing footsteps when no one's there. The last group that went in, well, let's just say they didn't make it out the way they came in." I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on the table. I glanced at the others, trying to gauge their reactions. John was scribbling something in his notebook, Emma was staring into her coffee cup, and Peter seemed more jittery than ever. "So, what's our plan?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Sarah smiled, but it was tight, forced. "We'll spend the night inside. We'll document everything, audio, video, anything we can. We need to figure out what's going on here. What it is that's keeping people away." As she spoke, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. I had read about cases like this, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all the more real. I had no idea what we were about to face. And part of me wondered if we were already in over our heads. I pushed the thought away and focused on the team, but it wasn't easy. Every part of me was on edge. Something about the group's dynamics felt off, as though everyone knew something I didn't. Sarah's uneasy demeanor, Emma's silence, Peter's nervousness, it all contributed to the growing sense of doubt that was taking root in my mind. Still, I couldn't back out now. I had already made the decision. But as I glanced around at the group, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be like any investigation I had done before. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just the school we had to worry about. The drive to Ohio felt like a descent into something darker. The closer we got to the school, the thicker the silence seemed to hang in the air. We had been on the road for hours, but it felt like the world outside had slowly grown more and more isolated. The landscape blurred past the windows, trees, fields, and small towns giving way to endless stretches of nothing. Every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last. I sat in the back seat, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The constant hum of the engine filled the car, but it did nothing to ease the unease gnawing at my insides. The others hadn't spoken much since we left the diner, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Peter's foot still tapped nervously, the rhythmic sound echoing through the car, while Emma's gaze remained fixed on the passing scenery, as though she were already somewhere far away. John kept his face buried in his equipment, checking and rechecking the technical gear, as if trying to distract himself from the reality of what we were about to face. I tried to focus on the familiar hum of the wheels, but my thoughts drifted back to other places I had visited in the past. Places where the air was thick with an unnatural presence. I had been to abandoned hospitals, empty houses, and crumbling mansions, each one as unsettling as the last. But this felt different. There was something about this school, something deeper, as if it had been waiting for us for a long time. The idea that no one had been able to explain the phenomenon there only added to the mystery, but it also brought a terrible question to the forefront of my mind. Why had no one made it out unchanged? I closed my eyes for a moment, the images flooding back. I remembered a house in rural Pennsylvania where the walls seemed to groan and shift like they were alive. The family had called us in because their daughter had started talking to someone invisible. At first, it seemed like a case of a child's overactive imagination, but as the investigation unfolded, the signs grew harder to ignore. Cold spots, flickering lights, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in empty hallways. I could still hear the low whispering that followed us everywhere we went, growing louder each night, until it felt like the very walls were closing in on us. I remembered the look on Greg's face when we finally left that place, his face pale, his hands shaking. Some things are better left alone, he had told me then. But I had been too eager, too determined to prove myself. We had walked away from that case, but I could never truly shake the feeling that something had followed me. And now, as the road twisted and turned before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had followed me back then had been waiting for me here. I glanced out the window, the sky above us heavy with clouds. A storm was brewing, the dark clouds swirling together in a way that felt unnatural, as if they were being pulled towards something. The wind had picked up, bending the trees along the roadside, and I could almost hear the faint echo of whispers in the distance. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. There was no one else out here, nothing but the road and the emptiness that stretched beyond it. Nearly there, Sarah's voice broke through the silence, pulling me back to the present. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her eyes hard, but the tension in her voice was unmistakable. We'll be at the school in about 20 minutes. Let's check the equipment and get ready. I nodded, but it didn't feel real. Nothing about this felt real. The school had already loomed large in my mind, its dark history hanging over us, and now, finally, we were almost there. I could feel the weight of the place even from miles away. It was as if the school itself was calling us, beckoning us forward. A heavy silence settled over the car again, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the tires on the road. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through. I could feel everyone else's nerves, their quiet anticipation. We were about to cross a line that couldn't be undone. I had heard the stories, seen the reports, and yet I couldn't quite prepare myself for what was waiting at the end of this road. I glanced at Peter, his face pale, eyes wide, as if he could already sense the presence of something unseen. He caught my gaze for a moment, his lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. He turned back to stare at the road ahead, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. The car slowed, the gravel crunching under the tires as we turned off the main highway and onto a smaller road that led up to the school. The trees seemed to crowd in around us, their branches twisting above, blocking out the sun. The air felt thicker here, heavier. I couldn't tell if it was the storm that was coming or something else. Whatever it was closing in fast. And then, there it was. The school. It stood in the distance, a looming silhouette against the darkening sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at us. My breath caught in my throat. Despite all the years of research, all the cases I had investigated, I had never experienced anything like this. The school was more than just a building, it felt alive, a place that had long since ceased to be just bricks and mortar. We were here. The car rolled to a stop at the gate, the rusted metal creaking as the wind picked up. And just like that, everything felt wrong. The car came to a slow stop in front of the school's wrought iron gates, their rusted bars groaning in the wind as if they were protesting our arrival. We all sat in uneasy silence for a moment, each of us staring out at the towering, decaying structure before us. The school stood like a fortress of shadows, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching us, waiting. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. The air seemed colder here, a sharp chill that crept into my bones despite the warmth of the car. It was the kind of cold that didn't belong, the kind that seemed to come from inside the building itself. The wind whipped around us, rustling the dead leaves scattered across the cracked asphalt, but even the wind felt wrong, too sharp, too purposeful. "We're here," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking the tension, but there was no relief in her tone. If anything, it only made the atmosphere heavier. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the moment I stepped out of the car, I was hit by a sudden wave of unease. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as if I wasn't standing on solid earth but something more elusive. My heart was beating faster now, a dull thrum in my chest, the kind of rhythm that matched the rising anxiety in the pit of my stomach. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like something was just waiting to make itself known. John shuffled nervously, adjusting his camera gear, his hands trembling slightly as he set up the equipment. Emma stood a few steps away, her eyes darting from the school to the surrounding woods, as though she were hearing something just out of reach. Peter's face was pale, his eyes wide, scanning the building as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "We should stick together," Sarah said, her voice firm, though her eyes betrayed the unease she was trying to hide. She stepped toward the gate, which creaked as she pulled it open. The sound echoed through the empty yard, making the silence that followed feel even more oppressive. The school loomed larger as we approached, its decaying walls covered in ivy, the stone steps cracked and uneven. The front doors, once grand, hung open as if inviting us in. The darkness inside was impenetrable, the air thick with a damp, musty smell that made my stomach churn. We all stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure of who would take the first step. My gaze flickered over to Sarah, who seemed to hesitate before stepping forward, her boots scraping against the gravel. The others followed, but I stayed back for a moment, my hand lingering on the cold metal of the gate. Something about this felt wrong. I had done this 100 times before, stepped into abandoned buildings, ready for whatever was lurking inside, but this was different. There was an oppressive weight here, as though the school itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make our move. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease that was steadily growing. "It's just nerves," I told myself. "Nothing more. We've been through this before." But as I took my first step onto the school grounds, the feeling didn't dissipate. It only intensified. The front door groaned as Sarah pushed it open, and the rest of us filed in behind her. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was, unnaturally quiet, like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We moved slowly through the dark, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating broken desks, overturned chairs, and peeling wallpaper. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, but the emptiness felt unnatural. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting in ways that didn't quite make sense. Then it came. A soft sound, almost like a whisper, but faint enough that I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice low and tense. "I didn't hear anything," Peter said, but there was a crack in his voice that made it clear he wasn't convinced. We all stood still for a moment, straining our ears. And then there it was again. A soft shuffle, followed by a faint scratching sound, like something or someone was moving through the darkness just beyond our reach. It was too faint to pinpoint, but it felt close, just on the edge of our perception. Sarah motioned for us to move forward, but I could feel her eyes flicking around the room as if she were waiting for something to appear. There was a tightness in her posture now, a sharp awareness of every creak and groan of the building. We moved deeper into the school, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt colder, heavier, as though something was slowly draining the warmth from the room. And then, I felt it, something cold and wet, brushing against my skin. A draft? No. The temperature had dropped too quickly, too suddenly. I turned to look at the others, but they were all focused ahead, moving forward with grim determination. No one seemed to notice the sudden drop in temperature except for me. The whispering sound returned, but this time it was clearer, almost like a voice, but too soft to make out any words. It was coming from down the hall, from the very heart of the building. "Let's stay close," Sarah whispered, her voice tight, strained. "We need to keep it together." But even as she spoke, the unease settled deeper in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been waiting for us here was now awake. The air inside the school felt like it had been locked away for years. Each breath I took was heavy, filled with the scent of damp wood and mildew, the kind of stale air that settles in when a place is left untouched for far too long. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of our footsteps on the dusty floor. We moved in a tight group, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the remnants of a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The school's halls were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams overhead. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, faded and cracked, revealing layers of forgotten history underneath. In some rooms, chalkboards remained, their surfaces smudged and forgotten, as if the lessons once held there had been abandoned in the middle of a sentence. Desks were scattered haphazardly, some overturned, others gathering dust in silent testimony to the time that had passed. Despite the overwhelming sense of decay, there were signs, small, subtle signs, that suggested we weren't alone. "Look at this," Peter muttered, bending down to examine a small pile of papers on the floor. The edges were frayed and yellowed, the words illegible from years of neglect. He carefully picked up a few, turning them over in his hands. "This looks like someone's been here recently." The rest of us gathered around, trying to make sense of the papers, but none of us could decipher the handwriting. It wasn't just the papers that unsettled me, though. It was the faint sense that the place had been disturbed recently. A door left ajar, a chair pushed out from under a desk drawer slightly open as if someone had been searching for something. Sarah motioned for us to move on. "Let's stay focused. We need to gather as much as we can." We continued down the hall, the floors creaking under our weight, the shadows stretching longer with every step we took. The sense of abandonment was overwhelming, yet there was something about it that didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too still, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. We reached the first classroom, a standard science room, judging by the cluttered counters and shelves filled with broken glass beakers and rusty equipment. The air was thick with the smell of old chemicals, a sharp, pungent stench that stung my nose. I stepped inside, the floor sticky beneath my boots, and immediately noticed the oddness of the room. The desks were arranged in neat rows, as though they had been set up just yesterday. But the dust settled on the edges of the tables, the thick layers that told me this room had been untouched for years. A quick scan of the room revealed more unsettling signs: a single pencil lying on the floor, its point sharp and new, and a half-empty cup of what looked like stale coffee on the corner of a desk. I crouched down to inspect it further. The liquid inside had long since solidified, but it was the faint odor that struck me. It wasn't just stale coffee. It was something else, something faintly wrong. "Sarah, check this out," I called, my voice low but urgent. She approached, her eyes narrowing as she examined the desk. She bent down and touched the pencil, then the cup, her brow furrowing in concentration. "That's strange," she said, looking around the room. "No one should be here. Not after all this time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like the room was watching me, waiting. We moved on, passing through more classrooms. Some were barely recognizable, their windows shattered, bookshelves overturned. Others were relatively intact, as though the very fabric of the school was frozen in time. Yet, the longer we explored, the more I felt like something was following us, just out of sight, a shadow lingering on the edge of my vision. In the next hallway, the unease grew stronger. The walls here were lined with faded photographs of past students, their faces frozen in time, staring back at us with hollow, vacant eyes. I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of discomfort, like we were intruding on something that was never meant to be disturbed. The air grew colder here, and my breath began to fog in front of me, even though the temperature had been steady when we first arrived. Peter stopped in front of one of the photographs, his face pale as he traced the image with his finger. This doesn't feel right. Look at their eyes." I glanced at the photograph he was pointing to. The students in the picture were dressed in uniforms, their smiles polite, but their eyes, those eyes, seemed vacant, almost hollow. There was something unsettling about them, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We all stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in around us. "I don't know about you guys," Emma said, her voice tight, "but I'm starting to feel like we're not alone here." Her words echoed in my mind, and I could feel the weight of them. She was right. There was something wrong about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And the longer we stayed, the more I was convinced that whatever was here had been waiting for us. We continued down the hall, our steps growing more cautious, each of us acutely aware of the strange sounds that seemed to follow us, soft whispers just at the edge of hearing, a faint scraping noise like nails against wood, or the sound of something shifting just out of sight. And then, from somewhere deeper within the school, we heard it. A loud bang, like a door slamming shut, followed by a faint, hollow laughter. It echoed down the hallway, reverberating off the walls, sending a chill through me. My blood ran cold. There was no way we were alone here. The question was, who or what else was waiting in the dark? The longer we wandered through the abandoned school, the more unsettled I became. The atmosphere inside was thick with an eerie silence that pressed in on us from all sides. But it wasn't just the absence of sound that disturbed me, it was the subtle hints of something else. The sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, just beyond the reach of our understanding. It was as if the building itself was trying to speak to us, in whispers that were too faint to grasp. We reached another hallway, dimly lit by our flashlights. The air felt colder here, as though the walls had absorbed the chill of years of abandonment. I shivered, adjusting my jacket against the unexpected drop in temperature. As I took a step forward, I heard it. A faint rustle. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat, and glanced over at Sarah. She was already looking back at me, her expression taut with the same unease I felt. "What was that?" I whispered, straining to hear. She shook her head. "I didn't hear anything." But I had. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something small moving along the floor, something dragging its feet. The sound seemed to come from the classroom at the end of the hall, just out of sight. I couldn't see anything through the dark doorway, but I felt an odd pressure in my chest, a nagging pull toward the source of the noise. I motioned for the others to stay back, then carefully approached the door. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked walls and broken furniture. I reached for the door handle, and as I touched it, I felt a coldness seep into my fingertips, a chill that wasn't natural, even for a decaying building like this. But I had to be rational. "It's just the wind," I told myself. "The place is falling apart. Old houses creak. Doors and windows move." I pushed the door open slowly, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The classroom was empty, save for the scattered remnants of a forgotten past. Papers littered the floor, overturned desks, and a single window was cracked open, letting in a breeze that caused the old curtains to flutter in a strange, unnatural rhythm. The wind. It must have been the wind. That's what it had to be. I stepped deeper into the room, my boots crunching on the broken glass beneath me. My breath came out in shallow bursts, the air growing colder by the second. But still, something didn't feel right. I could feel the tension in my muscles, the instinct to be on high alert, even though I tried to convince myself there was no need to be afraid. And then, it came again. A soft whisper. I froze. It was barely audible at first, a breathy sound, like someone trying to speak without moving their lips. I turned toward the source, my heart racing in my chest, but there was nothing there, only empty desks and dusty chalkboards. The whisper grew louder this time, a faint but distinct SHHH, followed by an unintelligible murmur. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows. I saw nothing. No figures. No movement. Just the desolate remnants of what had once been a classroom. I shook my head, forcing myself to breathe deeply. It was the wind. It had to be. The building was old, falling apart at the seams. The sound of the wind rushing through cracks in the walls could easily create the illusion of voices, especially in a place as silent as this. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice tight with uncertainty. Peter and Emma exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her brow furrowing. "I didn't hear anything." "Are you sure?" I pressed, feeling the unease creeping up on me again. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't just the wind. "I didn't hear anything," Peter said again, though his voice held a trace of doubt now, as if the silence had become too thick to ignore. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt the creeping sensation that something was there, watching us. "It's just the building," I tried to convince myself. "It's an old structure. Creaks, whispers, drafts, they all make noise." But the whispers wouldn't stop. They seemed to hang in the air, faint but persistent, like a presence that refused to be ignored. I moved back toward the door, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The chill in the room seemed to linger longer than before, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen as I left. "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, her voice low and tense. "We're not going to find anything standing around here." I nodded, but as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Not just the normal creaks and groans of an old building, but something else. Something alive. Or at least, something that once had been. As we moved through the hallways, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness behind us. Every whisper in the wind, every rustle of the old building seemed to echo with something deeper, something that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the growing fear that this place was more than just an abandoned school. Something had happened here, something that hadn't finished yet. Something was waiting for us. The deeper we ventured into the heart of the school, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I had always been sensitive to my surroundings, especially in places like this, where the air felt thick with history and decay. But there was something different about this place. Something I couldn't quite shake, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. The building seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain. Every step I took felt heavier, every creak in the floorboards amplified by the silence that surrounded us. It was the silence that was most unsettling, the way it pressed in on us like the walls themselves were closing in. It was as if the school itself was watching, waiting, listening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder more frequently than usual. "I don't like this," I muttered, my voice barely audible, but Sarah heard me. "Come on," she replied, her voice steady, though I could see the tension in her eyes. "You're just spooked." "It's nothing. This place is falling apart, that's all." But I wasn't so sure. Something about the stillness made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the oddest sensation, like eyes were boring into me from every corner, every shadow. I tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on the task at hand, exploring, investigating, but it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that we were being watched. We had just entered another room, a large, dark space, the kind of classroom that must have once been filled with rows of students, all diligently taking notes or listening to a lecture. Now it was empty, save for old furniture, disheveled papers, and broken windows. The room had a sense of abandonment, yet the unease continued to build as we moved further in. It was Emma who broke the silence first, her voice sharp and disbelieving. "Wait a second. This window. It wasn't open before." We all turned toward her. She was standing near the far wall, looking at a window that had previously been completely sealed, its wooden planks nailed over from the inside. Now, the planks were gone, the window wide open. The breeze that rushed in carried with it the faint scent of damp earth, but what struck me wasn't the breeze itself, it was the strange way the window had opened. "How the hell?" Peter muttered under his breath, stepping closer to inspect it. The window was high up, positioned almost out of reach from the ground, and it had been completely covered earlier, or so we thought. There was no sign of the planks that had once sealed it shut, no indication of how the wood had come loose. It didn't make any sense. We had checked the place thoroughly before, and this window had definitely been sealed tight. I felt the strange sensation grow stronger now. My chest tightened, and I couldn't help but feel that the school itself was somehow shifting around us, changing its structure without our permission. It was like the building had a life of its own. "That's impossible," I said, stepping forward to inspect the window myself. "Someone must have been here, but why would they open it now?" "It doesn't make sense," Sarah added, her voice a little shaky. She crossed her arms and turned to look around the room. "We would have noticed something like that earlier. No one could have gotten in without us hearing them." I nodded, but deep down, I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping up again. The feeling of being watched intensified, a strange, invisible presence that hovered just beyond our sight. As I turned to face the room again, I noticed the other windows. They were all shut, but there was something off about them too. The air felt heavier near each of them, as though the room was holding its breath. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and every sound, the whisper of the wind, the creak of the floorboards, sounded amplified, as if the very walls were trying to tell us something. "I don't like this," Emma said, her voice trembling now. "We need to get out of here. This place, it feels wrong." Peter, who had been quietly inspecting the open window, straightened up. "I agree. Something's not right." But just as he spoke, I heard it. A faint rustle, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Shoo!" I froze, my heart racing. The others didn't seem to hear it, but I could feel it in my bones, that strange vibration in the air that seemed to hum with anticipation. It was a whisper, but not from any of us. It came from deeper inside the building, somewhere in the shadows, like a voice trying to reach us, but we couldn't make out the words. I turned toward the others, my eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" They looked at me, confusion clouding their faces. "Hear what?" Sarah asked. "The whisper," I said, my voice shaking. It was like someone was right behind us. No one responded immediately. They exchanged uneasy glances, but no one seemed eager to acknowledge what I was saying. It felt as though they were trying to dismiss it, to pretend it was just the wind or the building settling, but deep down, I knew better. Something was in here with us. Something that didn't want us to leave. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, so much so that I could almost feel eyes on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement in the dark, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the open window, inviting whatever waited outside to come inside. "We need to go," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. But as I spoke, I heard it again, louder this time. A voice. Soft, cold, and close. The silence in the room was overwhelming, suffocating, and yet it was impossible to ignore the low, unsettling sound that had started again, the faint rustle, like fabric dragging against the floor. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it began to shift. The sound deepened, becoming more deliberate, more distinct. It was no longer just a rustle. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, began to echo through the room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were too precise, too human to be the wind or some random creak of the old building. And yet, the room was empty. No one was there. The sound grew louder, closer. Thump, thump, thump. Each step seemed to thud against the floor, slow and measured, as if someone, or something, was carefully pacing toward us. It was the kind of sound that made your skin prickle, your senses go on high alert, and every fiber of your being screamed to run. But none of us moved. Not yet. "What is that?" Sarah's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it still carried across the room, sharp and edged with fear. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry, my heart racing in my chest. I strained my ears to hear the sounds better, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from, but it was impossible. The footsteps seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the walls, filling the room with a sense of claustrophobic dread. We all stood still, frozen, our flashlights dancing across the decaying walls as we turned in every direction. There was nothing. Nothing but the noise. Is it coming from upstairs? Emma asked, her voice tight with anxiety. She seemed to be the first to break the silence, her eyes scanning the shadows. Maybe someone's here. Someone else. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to say it was just another group of people playing some cruel prank on us. But the steps didn't sound like they belonged to anyone alive. They were too deliberate, too slow, almost as though they were savoring each step, each sound that echoed in the dark. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as the footsteps grew louder, now unmistakably moving closer. It was as if something, or someone, was approaching us with intention. My hands began to tremble, and I instinctively took a step back, bumping into the doorframe. Should we split up? Peter suggested, his voice strained. But even he didn't seem convinced that would help. No, I shook my head. We stay together. Whatever that is, we need to stay close. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued to get closer, moving steadily toward us. And then, suddenly, there was a pause, a brief, breathless moment where the sound of footsteps disappeared. The room was too quiet. Too still. The air seemed to thicken, as if it were holding its breath. Maybe it's just the house settling? Sarah suggested weakly, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I wasn't so sure. The way the footsteps had stopped so suddenly felt wrong. Like whoever, or whatever, was making them had noticed us. Like it had been stalking us, toying with us, waiting for the right moment. Let's find out, I muttered, my voice barely audible to the others. My feet felt heavy as I took a step toward the door, my body moving more out of instinct than any sense of reasoning. The team followed me hesitantly, our footsteps almost drowned out by the sound of the slow, deliberate pacing still echoing somewhere in the dark, somewhere just beyond our reach. We moved cautiously through the hallway, the sound of the footsteps growing fainter as we moved further from the room. The air felt thick now, heavier, like something was pressing down on us from above. The shadows seemed to shift and warp as we walked, and with each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere. The sound of the footsteps had stopped, but the eerie quiet that replaced it felt even more suffocating, as if something were silently watching us. Where the hell is that coming from? Peter whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if he half expected something to emerge from the dark. I don't know, I replied, my own voice trembling. I turned the corner into the next room, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. And there it was again. Thump, thump, thump. The steps, now louder, clearer, definitely coming from above us. They were so close now, I could almost feel them, as if they were moving along the same floor, right underneath us. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was the sound of something dragging, something with weight. Something that shouldn't be here. I felt my heart skip in my chest. We need to get out of here, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. Now. But just as I turned to look at the others, a low, guttural sound echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. I jumped, my heart pounding against my ribcage. The noise was deafening, too sudden, too final. And then there was silence. Heavy silence. I didn't need to say it. We all knew what that sound meant. Something, or someone, had just sealed us in. The silence that followed the slamming door felt suffocating. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you, squeezing out every breath. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, drowning out everything else, and for a moment, I wondered if the others felt it too. The oppressive weight of whatever was happening around us. We stood there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. eyes darting around the dark corners of the hallway as though expecting someone to leap out at us. But the shadows remained still, unbroken. Then Peter spoke, his voice trembling. "Did anyone else hear that? A voice?" It was faint, but it sounded like whispers. Or laughter. We all turned to him. He was standing just a few feet away, eyes wide, searching the shadows like they held some dark secret he had yet to understand. "I heard something too," Emma said, her voice strained, her breath shallow. "I thought it was just my imagination, but it was like whispers." I couldn't make out the words, but before she could finish, we all heard it. Faint at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. A whisper. Soft, but insistent. It wasn't just one voice. There were several. "Is someone here?" Sarah asked, her eyes wild with fear. "This isn't funny anymore." I strained to listen, my own pulse thundering in my ears. The whispers were indistinct, like a low hum in the background, echoing off the walls. And just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Then, to my horror, it wasn't the only sound. I turned to look at Mark, our team's most level-headed member. He was standing near the door at the far end of the hallway, eyes wide, a look of utter disbelief etched across his face. He hadn't spoken a word since the door had slammed. But now, he moved, his hand reaching out toward the doorframe as if he was trying to touch the air around it, feeling something we couldn't. I don't know what I just heard," Mark muttered, his voice distant. "It was like a conversation. But not ours. It didn't sound like anything in here. It's like I could hear them, voices from somewhere far away." His eyes flicked toward us briefly, as if unsure whether he was imagining things. His hand trembled. "Mark, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep the panic from spilling out. But before he could answer, he stepped back, almost as if startled by something unseen. He looked over his shoulder, toward the dark corridor behind him, and for a brief moment, his face twisted in confusion. "It's like they want me to listen to something," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself. We all froze, watching him closely. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very space around us had changed, warped into something unfamiliar. Something hostile. "Mark, stop. You're scaring me," Sarah said, her voice cracking. She stepped forward, reaching out to him, but before she could get closer, something happened. Mark's head snapped to the side, his eyes wide with shock. Then, in a single, jerky movement, he turned and bolted toward the hallway. The sound of his footsteps was frantic, desperate, as if something was chasing him. "Mark, wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. He was gone, vanished into the shadows. We stood there in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a cold fog. "What the hell just happened?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where did he go?" I didn't know how to answer her. I didn't know where Mark had gone or what had driven him to run like that. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever had gotten to him was still here. And it was not done with us. I glanced at the others, their faces pale and anxious. "We need to find him," I said, though the words felt hollow. How could we find him when we didn't even know what we were dealing with? "Is it safe?" Peter asked, his voice trembling. Should we stay together?" "We don't have a choice," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. We need to find him, and we need to get out of here. Now. The whispers had returned. This time, they were clearer, louder, and with them came something else, another sound. A faint scraping noise, dragging along the floor behind us, moving closer. Something was following us. Something that wasn't Mark. And with every step we took, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the building itself was closing on us, trapping us inside. Mark had vanished. And now, we were alone in this place. Alone with whatever was waiting for us in the dark. We searched for hours, at least, I think it was hours. Time had become a strange, elusive concept in that place, the boundaries of reality growing thinner with each passing minute. The absence of Mark weighed on us like a heavy shroud, each one of us silently fearing that we might be next. The hallway stretched on, longer than it should have. Every room we entered seemed to lead to another, the same decaying classrooms and dark corridors that wound around like a maze. No matter which direction we took, we couldn't find the exit. The front door, the one we entered through just hours earlier, was now nowhere to be found. "We've been through here already," Emma said, her voice strained, her hand gripping her flashlight so tightly her knuckles were white. "How are we going in circles?" "I don't know," I muttered, swallowing hard. My throat was dry, and the feeling of unease had deepened into something more primal, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I kept looking back, half expecting Mark to appear from the shadows, but he never did. It felt as though the building itself was playing with us, trapping us in an endless loop of confusion. We reached a door we hadn't seen before, tucked at the end of an unfamiliar hallway. It seemed odd, the way the light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows against the walls. The door looked like any other, old and worn, but it felt different. Peter reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "This doesn't make sense. We should have been able to get out by now." I stepped forward, my hand brushing the door's frame. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like the air around it was damp with something not of this world. I pressed my ear to it, hoping to hear something on the other side, but there was only silence. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the muffled sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling. We turned to leave, but as I stepped away from the door, I noticed something else, something strange. The hallway we just walked down, it wasn't the same. The walls had changed. The windows were gone. The doors had shifted, subtly, but enough for us to feel the disorientation creeping in. I could swear that we hadn't seen that windowless wall before. "What the hell?" Sarah's voice trembled as she backed away, her eyes wide with confusion. "This wasn't here before." "I don't understand," I murmured, stepping back further into the hallway. The air felt colder now, almost as if it were closing in on us. A low hum reverberated in the walls, distant but growing louder. It was like a low, constant vibration in the ground, thrumming beneath our feet, shaking the air. "The walls," Peter said suddenly, his voice tense. They feel like they're moving. Have you noticed?" I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. "It's just our nerves," I thought. "We're all just scared, and the building is old. It's creaking, shifting. We'll find a way out." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something far worse than simple disorientation. We turned back to the door we had tried earlier, only to find that it wasn't the same door anymore. The handle had changed. It had moved. "What the hell?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising with panic as she reached for the handle. But it wouldn't turn. No matter how much she tugged, the door wouldn't open. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, then went blank. Mark wouldn't just leave us, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. He wouldn't. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Mark had run from us, as if something had taken control of him. And now, as we stood in this labyrinth of darkened corridors, I wondered if that same force was pulling the strings behind everything else. The doors, the walls, the whispers. Peter knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood in a pattern that seemed almost too deliberate, too perfect. 3 knocks. Then silence. "Mark? Are you in there?" he called out, his voice cracking with frustration. Nothing. I stepped away from the door, my mind racing for answers. Was this some kind of sick prank? But I knew it wasn't. This felt different. This felt wrong in a way that I couldn't explain, a creeping sensation that made every instinct in my body scream to leave. But I couldn't leave. None of us could. Suddenly, the door rattled. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest as the handle jerked. For a split second, I thought maybe someone, maybe even Mark, was on the other side, trying to break through. But then it stopped. And that's when the real horror set in. A low, guttural voice, distorted and unnatural, slithered through the cracks in the door. It was barely audible at first, but then it grew clearer. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were cold, hollow, as if they were being spoken from a great distance. But the thing that really made my blood run cold was the unmistakable feeling that it wasn't speaking to us. It was speaking through us. Like it had always been here. Always waiting. I turned to face the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. We were all thinking the same thing. We were trapped. Trapped in this place with something that had no intention of letting us leave. The air around us seemed to thicken with every passing moment, the weight of something unseen pressing against us, squeezing the very breath from our lungs. We stood in the center of the hallway, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the shadows they cast seemed to move of their own accord, twitching, stretching, almost alive. "I can't," Emma began, her voice trembling as she raised her flashlight higher, but the beam flickered and sputtered, briefly plunging us into a deeper darkness. "What's happening to the lights?" Before anyone could respond, the beam of my flashlight fluttered too, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls that danced unnaturally, as though they had a life of their own. I swung the light in a wide arc, trying to dispel the creeping darkness, but it didn't help. The shadows stretched, growing longer, twisting in ways that no light could explain. "Maybe it's just the wiring," Peter suggested, his voice too calm. "This place is falling apart, right?" But even as he said it, I could hear the unease creeping into his voice. I glanced at him, and for a brief moment, I saw the reflection of something that wasn't quite right. Something was moving in the dark, just out of sight, just at the edge of my vision. It was like the shadows themselves were breathing. I pointed my flashlight toward the corner of the hall. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a trick my mind was playing on me, but then it moved again. A shadow, tall and thin, stretching impossibly across the wall. It wasn't the right shape. It wasn't normal. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "See what?" Emma asked, her flashlight trembling in her hands as she searched the room. "Right there," I said, my heart racing. "In the corner." The shadow twitched, then slid across the floor as though it was crawling toward us. No light had caused it, no movement of ours. It simply existed, like something that had always been there, waiting. I raised my flashlight, moving cautiously toward the spot, but the shadow vanished before I could reach it. It was gone, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of wall behind. I don't think this is just bad wiring," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tremor was unmistakable. Sarah, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, her breath shallow. I don't like this. This place, it's wrong." The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and then they went out completely. The darkness was immediate, suffocating. My eyes strained, trying to make out anything at all, but the world was swallowed up by an impenetrable blackness. We were plunged into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. "What the hell?" Peter's voice cracked in the darkness. "I can't see a thing." "Emma, turn the flashlight back on." But the flashlight wouldn't respond. No matter how many times she flicked the switch, the light refused to cooperate. The low hum of the building, the noise we had felt earlier beneath the floors, grew louder, almost deafening, shaking the walls around us. I fumbled for my own light, my hand shaking as I reached for it. When it finally flickered to life, the weak beam cast long, trembling shadows down the hallway. But it wasn't just the shadows that I saw. Movement. Something moved in the darkness, far beyond the reach of my flashlight. A shape, a person, perhaps? No. It was too large, too distorted, twisting unnaturally as it glided across the hall. A shape that was at once there and not there, as though it was something pulled from the deepest corners of my mind. "Look out!" Sarah screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. I swung the light toward her, but she wasn't where she had been. Instead, she stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. "Sarah!" I shouted, but there was no response. My flashlight flickered again, and when the beam steadied, I saw it. The shape. The shadow. It was right behind her. I could see the dark figure moving, its form indistinct but growing larger. It crept forward in slow, deliberate steps. The walls seemed to bend around it, distorting the space as though the very fabric of the hallway was twisting to accommodate the presence. Without thinking, I lunged towards Sarah, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. She didn't resist. Her body was stiff, like she was barely aware of what was happening around her. Her gaze was locked on something behind me, something I couldn't see. "Sarah, snap out of it!" I shouted, shaking her by the shoulders. "We have to get out of here." But then, the lights flickered again, this time staying out for several seconds, and in that brief moment of complete darkness, something shifted. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the hallway. The air thickened, the temperature plummeted, and I could hear it. The sound of something moving, something breathing, or was it growling? I couldn't tell. When the light came back, everything had changed. The hallway was empty. No shadow. No figure. No Sarah. Just the four of us standing in the dark, staring at the space where she had been, now utterly gone. "What the hell is going on?" Peter breathed. "Where is she? Where's Sarah?" I didn't know. But in that moment, I understood something chilling. Whatever was here, it wasn't just playing games anymore. It was hunting us. The silence that followed Sarah's disappearance was suffocating. We stood frozen in place, the dim light of our flashlights trembling in the air as the walls seemed to close in around us. The temperature had dropped again, and an unnatural stillness had settled over the school, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it came. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A screech. It was the sound of chalk scraping against a blackboard, high-pitched and jagged, like nails on glass. The sharp, relentless squeal of it sliced through the silence, sending a cold shiver down my spine. It came from somewhere in the distance, deeper in the school, echoing down the empty corridors. "Do you hear that?" Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat tight. The sound was too distinct to ignore. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the settling of the building. No, this was something deliberate. Something alive. The sound of chalk digging into the board, of words being written, but there was no one there. "We should check it out," Emma said, her voice trembling but determined. She took a step forward, holding her flashlight out in front of her, its beam flickering as it cut through the thick darkness. "It's coming from one of the classrooms." I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed for us to turn back, to run, to escape. But the sound of that chalkboard, that eerie, unyielding noise, drew me forward. We had to find out what was happening, why this place was so twisted, so wrong. And maybe, just maybe, it would give us some answers about Sarah. We moved down the hall, the sound growing louder, more insistent. It was as though whatever, or whoever, was doing it was getting closer. Each screeching motion made my skin crawl, my fingers gripping the flashlight tighter. We reached the door to one of the classrooms, the noise coming from inside. It was so loud now, so close, that it was almost impossible to believe there was no one there. The door creaked as Peter pushed it open, the sound of the hinges grinding into the stillness. Inside, the room was empty, save for the rows of old desks covered in dust, papers scattered across the floor. But the chalkboard at the front of the room, that was where the noise was coming from. I froze in the doorway, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it toward the board. The surface was scuffed, worn down by years of use, but now it looked different. The chalk was moving on its own. Slowly, deliberately, it scraped across the board, leaving faint, uneven lines behind it. Screech. The sound was unbearable. It felt like it was digging into my mind, worming its way into my thoughts. The chalk wasn't just writing, it was scratching the surface, like it was trying to claw its way free. I could feel the vibrations in the air, like the very walls were resonating with it, shaking with the force of the sound. "What the hell is happening?" Emma whispered, her voice low and shaky. Before I could answer, the chalk stopped. The board was silent for a moment, and for a heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. Then, something else happened. A word began to appear, slowly and unevenly, as if it were being written by invisible hands. "Help." The letters formed one by one, the chalk dragging across the board, but it wasn't just the motion of the writing that was terrifying. It was the way the word felt, like it was reaching out to us, pulling us in. Like it was begging us to listen. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't help myself. The word was familiar, yet I didn't know why. Maybe it was because we had been searching for answers for so long, or maybe it was because something inside me already knew that whatever was happening in this place, we were part of it now. "Who's doing this?" Peter's voice cracked as he stepped closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. Help. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was a command. It was a plea. The chalkboard began to shake, as if something was pressing against it from the other side, something that wanted to break free. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the writing stopped. The chalk dropped to the floor with a loud clatter, and the room fell into complete, suffocating silence. But that silence didn't last long. A new sound filled the air, low, rasping, like something struggling to breathe. It came from the chalkboard again, only this time, it wasn't the sound of writing. It was the sound of scratching. Something was moving behind the board. Something that didn't belong. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I could see the outline of a figure now, distorted, its shape barely visible through the cracks in the old wood. It was trying to claw its way through, its fingers, or whatever it had, scraping relentlessly against the surface, pushing against the confines of the board. And then, in the reflection of the glass behind me, I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing in the doorway. Its face was a blur, but I could feel it watching me, watching us. We weren't alone. Whatever had been writing on that board had hurt us, and now it was coming for us. The air grew heavy again, the temperature dropping even further as the figure stepped forward, its movement smooth and unnatural, like it was gliding across the room, its presence suffocating everything in its path. I turned to run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure's shadow loomed larger, closer. It was all around us now. We were no longer alone in the classroom. We were trapped. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the shadows stretch toward me like something alive. The figure, whatever it was, loomed in the corner of my vision, its presence undeniable. It was there, moving, but I couldn't see it clearly, couldn't make sense of it. My mind screamed for an explanation, any explanation that could bring me back to reality. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to hold onto that fragile thread of reason. The chalkboard, the moving shadows, Sarah's disappearance, it was all too much. Too impossible. It's just a prank, I told myself. This is some kind of elaborate setup. Someone is messing with us. But even as the thought formed, it felt hollow, like an echo in a vast, empty room. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest, too loud, too insistent, drowning out the whispers of logic. "Peter, Emma," I said, my voice shaky as I turned toward them. "This has to be some kind of joke, right? Someone is playing tricks on us. They must have rigged the chalkboard somehow. The shadows, maybe it's just the way the light's bouncing off the walls, creating illusions." Emma's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking, and I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her flashlight like a lifeline. "I don't know, Sam. This doesn't feel like a joke." I turned back to the chalkboard. The word help was still there, jagged and scrawled, as if it had been etched into the surface by a desperate hand. The chalk had fallen to the floor, but the lingering smell of old dust mixed with something else, something cold, something wrong. I stepped closer, my feet dragging through the heavy air, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of this place before it consumed us entirely. But I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, pulling me forward. "It's just the stress," I thought. "This place is messing with my head. We're tired, we're jumpy." But even as I tried to reassure myself, I felt the walls close in, the suffocating pressure building in my chest. The shadows weren't just shadows. They moved. The chalkboard hadn't just scraped itself, it had written a word, a plea. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion. Maybe it's just the acoustics in here, or the vibrations from the old building. The chalkboard could have been left in a position where it made noise on its own, right? The wind could have. Sam, stop. Emma's voice cut through the air, sharp and desperate. Please. Stop trying to make sense of this. There's no way any of this is natural. We're not imagining it. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I glanced at her, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of fear in her eyes, something deeper than the terror we were all feeling. It was more than fear. It was something else, something unspoken. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stepped back from the board, trying to put some distance between myself and the madness that seemed to be closing in. The sound of scratching from behind the board had stopped, but I could still hear it, the breathe of the building, below almost something just beneath the surface. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to think logically. It's just an old building, I told myself. A building full of old things. Noises happen. Shadows play tricks on the eyes. But deep inside, a voice, the kind of voice you hear when you're alone in the dark, when the world starts to unravel, whispered, you know it's not just that. You know something's wrong here. You know this place isn't just old. It's haunted. It's alive. The thought paralyzed me. It was like a crack in my mind, a fissure that I couldn't ignore anymore. Every instinct screamed that I had to get out, that none of this was normal. I tried to push it away, to deny it, but the feeling was too strong. Too real. I looked around the room, desperately trying to find a rational explanation. The desks, the windows, the scattered papers, they all seemed ordinary, like nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened here. Yet everything about the place felt wrong. The air was too thick. The shadows were too deep. This isn't just fear, I thought. This isn't just stress. This is something else. Something I can't explain. Something that doesn't want to be explained. I turned to Peter, who was standing just behind me. His face was ashen, his eyes wide, but he wasn't speaking. He was staring at the chalkboard, his gaze unfocused, almost like he was seeing something beyond it. You're thinking it too, aren't you? I whispered, my voice trembling. Peter didn't respond, but his silence said everything. We were trapped in a place that didn't obey the rules of logic, of reason. And the more I tried to understand it, the more it slipped from my grasp, like sand running through my fingers. No more excuses. No more explanations. Whatever was happening here, whatever was pulling us deeper into this nightmare, was beyond anything we could comprehend. The air felt thick, heavy, like we were all drowning in it. Every breath came with difficulty, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on us. The strange noises had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. It was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to break. We stood in a circle, half-heartedly trying to make sense of what had just happened. No one spoke at first. The tension in the room was palpable, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. My heart was still racing from the shock of everything I had witnessed. The chalkboard, the shadows, Sarah's disappearance. It was all too much, too impossible. Finally, it was Peter who spoke, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. What the hell is going on? This isn't real. It can't be real. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, we all stared at him. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling as they gripped the flashlight. He was trying so hard to keep it together, but it was clear from his voice that he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I've been trying to tell myself the same thing. This is some kind of experiment. A setup. Someone's playing a trick on us, right? A prank." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The fear in Emma's eyes, the way the air felt alive with something darker than any of us could explain, it was all too real. Emma let out a shaky breath and stepped closer to us. "It's not a prank, Sam. I don't think it's a prank." Her voice was almost pleading, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as us. "This place, it feels wrong. Like it's alive. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like we're not alone. Like something is watching us." Her words cut through the silence like a blade, and for a moment, I thought I might drown in the weight of it all. She wasn't wrong. I felt it too. The air was thick with something unseen, pressing on us from every direction. And as much as I wanted to believe this was just stress, just fear, I couldn't deny what was happening. I turned to Peter, trying to anchor myself in something solid. "What do we do now? We can't just leave, can we? The doors, they won't open." He nodded, his face pale and strained. "I don't know. I don't know what to do anymore. I keep thinking I'm going crazy. I keep trying to tell myself that we're just exhausted, that we're imagining things. Are we, though?" Emma asked softly, her voice trembling. "I keep seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that aren't really there. Figures that..." She stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. "I don't know what's real anymore." I swallowed hard, trying to force the tightness in my chest to loosen. It wasn't working. I keep telling myself it's just our minds playing tricks on us. That we're not really hearing things. That the shadows are just the light. But my own words rang hollow. The look in Peter's eyes, the desperate pleading in Emma's gaze, it was all too real. Something was happening, something beyond our control. "Do you think Sarah's?" I couldn't bring myself to finish the question, but they both knew what I meant. Peter shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. I can't even begin to think about that. Not yet." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't as suffocating. It was more of a resigned silence. We had reached the point where we couldn't keep pretending anymore. No amount of logic or rational thinking was going to explain away what we had seen. Emma leaned against the wall, rubbing her arms as if to ward off an invisible chill. "What if we're not going to make it out of here?" she whispered, almost to herself. The question hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I truly felt the weight of it, the realization that we might be trapped, not just in this building, but in something far worse. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, that we could figure it out. But I couldn't. Now I was starting to doubt everything myself. "We have to get out," I said finally, my voice steady but shaky. "We have to find a way out, no matter what. We can't let this place take us." But as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a cold wave of doubt wash over me. What if we couldn't? What if this place had already claimed us, one way or another? I looked at Peter and Emma, both of them caught in their own spirals of doubt and fear. For the first time since we arrived, I felt the isolation settle in, this deep, gnawing feeling that we were completely alone in a place that didn't care if we lived or died. A place that wasn't bound by the same rules of time and space that we were. "We're not alone," Emma whispered again, her eyes wide with terror. "Whatever is in here with us, it wants us. It's been waiting for us." The words hung between us, heavy and final, and for the first time, I realized just how powerless we were. No matter how much we fought to explain it away, no matter how much we searched for a logical answer, the truth was something darker, something we couldn't understand. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. We weren't alone. And we might never leave this place. The cold seemed to settle deeper into my bones as we ventured further into the school. The walls felt like they were closing in, and each step seemed heavier than the last. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in the oppressive silence, each sound magnified in the stillness. It was as if the building itself was watching us, waiting, listening. We had reached the second floor, the hallway lit only by the dim beams of our flashlights. The air was thick, almost sticky, and I could taste the dust, stale and heavy, with every breath. The longer we stayed, the more uncomfortable I became. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. Something was watching us. I had been trying to block out the creeping sense of unease that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind ever since Sarah had disappeared, but it was becoming impossible. Every corner we turned, every room we stepped into, seemed to hold something just out of sight, waiting for us to notice it. Then it happened. I saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of the hallway, too quick to be real. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I was certain it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, there it was, more distinct this time. A figure. Small, dark, and fleeting. It was a child, no older than 10, with a mop of messy hair and a school uniform, standing at the far end of the hallway. For a split second, I thought I'd imagined it, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. The child was staring straight at me, their eyes wide and unblinking, empty of life yet full of something that chilled me to the core. Before I could move, before I could even process what was happening, the child vanished. No sound, no movement. Just a flicker of darkness where there had been a figure moments before. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My breath quickened, and I turned to Peter and Emma, who were a few steps behind me. They hadn't seen it. Of course, they hadn't. "Did you see that?" I whispered, trying to steady my voice, but it trembled despite my best efforts. They both looked at me, confusion painting their faces. "See what?" Peter asked, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to return to the spot where I had seen the figure. Nothing. Just an empty hallway, the flickering light above casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. "It was nothing," I muttered, shaking my head. "Just my imagination." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen something. And it wasn't the first time I had felt that cold shiver creep down my spine, the sensation that we were being watched, that something unseen was following our every move. We continued down the hallway, but now, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race. Every dark corner felt like it was hiding something, something that didn't belong. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just the stress, the lack of sleep, the overwhelming dread that had taken over. But I couldn't. The more we walked, the more I saw. At the far end of the hallway, another shadow appeared. This time, it was a group of children, gathered together like they were waiting for something. Their figures were indistinct, their faces obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their presence, cold, empty, watching. I blinked, and they were gone, just like the first. No sound, no trace. Sam? Emma's voice cut through the silence, sharp with concern. She was standing a few feet behind me, her eyes wide and fixed on the space ahead. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I turned to her, my throat dry, my mind scrambling for something to say, some way to explain it. But how could I? How could I tell her I had seen children, ghosts, in the halls, when I barely believed it myself? I think we should get out of here, I said, my voice rough. Now. Sam, you're scaring me, Peter said, taking a step closer. What's going on? What did you see? I shook my head, not knowing how to explain it. I didn't want to admit it, didn't want to believe it, but I had no choice. What we were experiencing wasn't normal. It wasn't just a trick of the light or the result of stress. There was something here, something that didn't belong, and it was watching us. We need to stick together, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We can't split up. But I knew it wouldn't matter. We were already too far in. Whatever was in this school, whatever haunted these halls, it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. The shadows of the children lingered in my mind, their empty eyes fixed on me even as we moved further into the school. We were no longer alone. And whatever this place was, it wasn't finished with us. The silence in the classroom was stifling. We had entered a small, dusty room that, unlike the others, wasn't entirely stripped of its remnants. The walls were lined with cracked wooden shelves, their surfaces covered in layers of dust, and the floor creaked under our weight. But it wasn't the decay that caught my attention, it was the feeling, the almost oppressive weight of the room itself, as though it was holding onto something. Something important. Something we weren't supposed to find. Emma and Peter had already begun to sift through the debris in the back of the room, rummaging through piles of old books and papers, the musty smell of decaying paper mixing with the stagnant air. The light from our flashlights flickered on the walls, casting long, eerie shadows that made the room feel even more claustrophobic. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something watching us from the corners of the room, something ancient, buried beneath the years of neglect. Peter's voice broke the silence. "Hey, look at this," he called out, his tone strange, filled with an odd reverence. I turned toward him, my pulse quickening. He was holding a stack of old photographs, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. I walked over, curiosity getting the better of me, and peered over his shoulder at the pictures. They were black and white, faded images of children in old-fashioned school uniforms. They seemed so out of place. The children in the pictures were posed stiffly, their faces too serious for their age, their eyes staring at the camera as if they were aware of something we couldn't see. I felt a chill run through me as I glanced at their faces, something about the stillness of the images, the blankness in their eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if the children weren't just frozen in time, but were trapped in it, stuck in these photographs, forever watching. "Where do you think these came from?" Emma asked, her voice quiet. She stood next to Peter, her hand hovering over a pile of documents that had been hidden beneath the photos. She started flipping through them, each page worn and brittle, the ink faded almost to the point of illegibility. "Maybe from the old students?" I suggested, my voice sounding hollow in the still air. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. There was something off about these photos, something more sinister. The children looked like they belonged here, like they were part of this place in a way that was too intimate, too familiar. It was as though they had never really left. Emma found something that made her stop. She pulled out a crumpled letter, its edges torn, its once typed text now barely visible. "Sam," she whispered, handing it to me. "You need to see this." I took the letter from her, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it carefully. It was dated over 50 years ago, and the handwriting on it was slanted, almost frantic. As I read through it, a cold dread began to coil in my stomach. "I have seen them. I know what they are, and I know what they want. They are the ones who never left, the ones who were never meant to leave. I can hear them every night, whispering my name, scratching at my door. They are waiting for more, and soon they will have what they need. They will never stop until they do." The words sent a wave of nausea through me, and I had to take a moment to steady myself. Who had written this? And what were they talking about? The children in the photographs? The voices we had been hearing? "Sam?" Peter's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "What does it mean? What's this about?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice distant as I continued to scan the letter. "But it doesn't sound like a prank. This sounds real." Emma leaned closer, her face pale. "Is it possible these were the students who disappeared? The ones who never made it out?" I didn't want to think about that, didn't want to entertain the possibility that the children in the photos, the ones whose eyes seemed so knowing, might be connected to whatever dark force lingered in this place. But the more I thought about it, the more the weight of the letter pressed on me, heavy with the knowledge that there were things in this school far beyond our understanding. The documents continued to pile up, some of them just as cryptic and unsettling as the letter. There were mentions of strange occurrences, missing students, unexplained deaths, whispers of rituals performed in secret. As we uncovered more, it became clear that the school wasn't just abandoned, it was hiding something. Something it didn't want us to find. "We have to leave," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. The air in the room had grown thicker, almost suffocating. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and the weight of the past pressed down on us, threatening to pull us under. "This place, it's not just haunted. It's hiding something." Emma and Peter exchanged uneasy glances, their faces reflecting the same fear that gnawed at me. We had come here searching for answers, but all we had found were more questions, questions that now felt dangerously close to the truth. And that truth was something none of us were ready to face. "We need to stick together," I said, my voice low, though the words barely made sense in my own head. The feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark, the photographs, the letter, it all added up to something far worse than we had imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just stumbled upon something we weren't meant to understand, something that would never let us leave until we had uncovered its deepest secret. And maybe, just maybe, that secret would be our undoing. The silence that followed our discovery in the classroom was thick, almost suffocating. As we stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a forgotten past, the weight of the moment pressed down on us. We had uncovered something we weren't supposed to find. But just as the dread began to settle into the pit of my stomach, something else began to shift. At first, it was subtle. A whisper, barely audible, drifting through the air like the rustle of a leaf in the wind. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The others didn't seem to notice, their attention still focused on the scattered papers and photographs we had uncovered. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was soft, almost like a breath, a voice, distant and muffled. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the building settling under the weight of its age. But then it came again. Louder this time. Not just one whisper, but several. They seemed to echo off the walls, rising and falling in pitch, as though someone, or something, was speaking just out of reach. The words were unclear, garbled, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper as she glanced up from the documents in her hands. She wasn't looking at me, but rather at the hallway just outside the door. I nodded, my throat tight. The air had grown unnaturally still, too still. I could feel the weight of the whispers pressing in on me, pushing at the edges of my consciousness, clawing to be heard. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Probably just the building settling, Peter suggested, though even his voice held an edge of uncertainty. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting something to jump out at him. Old buildings make noises. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to dismiss the feeling creeping over me, the gnawing sense that something was watching us from the shadows. But I couldn't. The whispers weren't just noises. They were intentional. They were speaking to us, and they weren't stopping. The sound of a door creaking open somewhere down the hall made me jump. I turned, my heart pounding, but when I scanned the hallway through the dim light, there was nothing there. Just more shadows, stretching long across the walls, untouched by our flashlights. The whispers grew louder again, closer this time. I could hear the faintest rustling of footsteps, followed by a soft, almost melodic voice, so low, so gentle that it felt like it was being whispered directly into my ear. But no one was behind me. "Sam." The voice called, the name so soft and familiar, yet wrong. I spun around, breath catching in my chest, but once again, there was nothing. Only Peter and Emma, both visibly on edge now, their eyes wide with the same unease that was crawling beneath my skin. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell them to be quiet, to listen, but before I could, the whispers changed. It was as if the air itself shifted, the temperature dropping a few degrees in an instant. The voices, once faint and unintelligible, were now clear, sharp. They were no longer whispers. They were full, desperate cries, echoing through the walls with such intensity that I felt the sound reverberate in my chest. "Help us!" The cry was guttural, full of pain, of fear. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but I could feel the anguish in it, feel the desperation. The air seemed to hum with the weight of it, like the walls themselves were alive with this tortured energy. "Please, help us." I could feel my pulse in my ears now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Emma took a step back, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse as I took a step toward the door, my heart racing. But the moment I turned, the cries escalated. "No!" The scream was deafening now, shrill and filled with a raw, animal-like terror that sent a shock of fear through my body. It was a cry of agony, of someone, or something, fighting for their very life, for their very soul. The walls seemed to tremble as the sound washed over us, vibrating through the floor, the ceiling, the air. I froze in place, rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and ragged. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark hallway. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, like the stillness of a graveyard, too quiet, too unnatural. We stood there, frozen, the cold sweat trickling down my back, the taste of fear sharp on my tongue. No one spoke. The room seemed to close in on us, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the school pressing down on my chest. What was that?" Peter finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. What could I say? That we weren't alone? That something was in this school with us, something desperate, something that was begging for help but was too far gone to save? I didn't know. All I knew was that the whispers had changed into something more terrifying, something darker. And I didn't think we'd be able to leave until we understood what had happened here. And even then, I wasn't sure if we'd survive it. The silence after the screams was suffocating. No one moved, no one breathed. The heavy air seemed to press down on us, thick with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls of the school were alive, listening, waiting. As I stood there, trying to collect myself, something strange happened. A cold draft swept through the room, making the dust in the air swirl like tiny, ghostly shapes. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I glanced over at Peter and Emma. Both of them were staring at the floor, their faces pale and strained. Then, just as I began to regain some semblance of control over my breathing, I saw it. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint shimmer in the air. A ripple, like a breeze stirring the air around us. I blinked, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me. But no! It was real. The shimmer grew more pronounced, and then, from the corner of the room, a faint outline began to form, a figure. It appeared as though it was made of smoke, drifting in and out of focus, as though it didn't fully belong to this world. A child's figure, small, with features indistinct and hazy, standing at the far end of the room. I could barely breathe as I stared at it. It wasn't like the other shadows we had seen earlier, those fleeting glimpses of movement. This was something different. It was not a shadow. It was real. A spirit. And it was looking directly at me. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. Instead, it held its place, staring at me with a vacant, sorrowful gaze. Then, without warning, it slowly extended its hand, just a few inches, but the gesture was unmistakable. The hand was trembling. "Do you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice tight with fear. I nodded, unable to speak, too paralyzed to do anything but stare. The figure slowly moved forward, the air around it growing colder with each step. As it approached, I could feel an undeniable sense of sadness, of longing. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was lost. I reached out instinctively, as if some invisible force was pulling me closer to it. My heart hammered in my chest, my body trembling with a mix of fear and something else, something that felt like sympathy. A part of me knew I shouldn't be doing this. I should be running, getting out of this place while I still could. But something about this ghost, this spirit, seemed different from the others. It was asking for something. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, the figure suddenly vanished. I gasped, my body jerking back as the air went still again. But it wasn't gone completely. A moment later, I saw something new, a series of faint scratches, carved into the dust on the floor, forming a pattern. It was a message. "Help us, find the way out." I couldn't speak. The words weren't just etched into the dust, they were alive. I could feel them. The ghost was communicating. It wanted something. Something more than just a simple plea for help. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any explanation, anything that would make sense of what was happening. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. The scratches in the dust weren't random. They were deliberate, forming a pattern, like a riddle, a puzzle. I crouched down, heart racing, as I studied the markings more closely. There were symbols, words, letters twisted and bent, but these seemed out of order, fragmented. The message wasn't fully clear, not yet. "The ghost is trying to tell us something," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Emma looked at me with wide eyes, but before she could say anything, a cold, echoing laugh broke the silence. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. The sound crawled under my skin, sending a chill through my bones. The spirit hadn't disappeared at all. It was still there, watching, waiting. The scratching continued, this time more frantically, the markings on the floor twisting and rearranging. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The figure reappeared, but now it wasn't the child I had seen earlier. It had morphed, becoming something more abstract, a face, blurred and disfigured, with a mouth that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide, a silent scream. The figure reached out again, but this time its hand wasn't trembling. It was firm, insistent, almost as though it were beckoning me. And I knew, in that moment, that it was giving me a choice. I could follow it, or I could run. The scratching on the floor intensified, urging me forward. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. There was no time to think. I took a step forward, towards the ghost. The room seemed to grow colder still, the shadows pressing in on me, as the ghost, the child, moved, dissolving into the air around me. And then I saw it. Another message, clearer this time, as though it had been waiting for me to understand. A set of symbols had been carved into the wooden floorboards just beneath where the ghost had stood. I read the riddle aloud before I could stop myself. What's lost in time, but never gone, waiting for the living to carry on? I felt the weight of the question pressing down on me, the very air thick with the answer. The room seemed to hold its breath as I struggled to make sense of it. But before I could speak, the air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable low. The shadow of the ghost lingered in the corner, waiting for me to solve its riddle. In that moment, I realized that the answers were in this place. But what would I uncover next? And would it be enough to escape, if we could escape at all? The room around me seemed to distort. The walls pulsed, bending as though they were alive, breathing in time with the rising tension in my chest. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and as I blinked, the world shifted. For a moment, I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something was truly wrong with this place. I looked up at Peter and Emma. Both of them were staring at me, their eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just fear I saw. There was something else, something deeper, darker, that I couldn't quite place. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if my very body had been frozen in place. Then, the first of the hallucinations began. I felt a pull, like an invisible thread tethering me to the floor. My body lurched, and the room tilted. My vision blurred, and I suddenly found myself somewhere else, back in the hallway. But this wasn't the same hallway. The walls were pristine, the air warm, and the light was soft, casting long, familiar shadows across the floor. It was as if I had been transported back in time, back to when this school wasn't abandoned, when it was alive with voices and footsteps. I blinked again, trying to shake the feeling off, but it didn't work. The students, the laughter, the chatter, they were all around me. I saw them in the classrooms, sitting at their desks, their voices a blur of noise, but it was real. The warmth in the air was real. Then, I saw him. The boy from the photo we had found earlier. The one with the faded smile, his eyes dark with something that I couldn't quite understand. He was standing by the door, staring at me with those same haunting eyes. He didn't speak, but I felt his gaze, heavy and knowing. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, but the words felt hollow in the air. The world was too vivid, too alive. But as quickly as the vision came, it faded. The warmth disappeared. The laughter and voices were swallowed up by silence. I was back in the dark hallway, the cold air pressing down on me like a weight. "Did you see that?" I heard Peter's voice, trembling. I turned to him, my heart racing. I don't know," I stammered. "What did you see?" But Peter wasn't looking at me. He was staring down the hallway, his eyes wide with panic. I saw us," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Us, walking here, through these very halls. It felt like it already happened. Like we were here before." My blood ran cold. I felt Emma's hand on my arm, her grip tight. She was shaking, too, and when I looked at her, I could see it, the same confusion, the same fear. I was just in the classroom," she said, her voice distant. "It was like I never left. Everything was so clear, so real. The hallucinations were spreading. They were consuming us, warping our perception of reality." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my mind. "We need to keep moving. We need to focus on getting out of here." But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough anymore. These weren't just hallucinations. This place, this school, was pulling at us, manipulating our very perception of time and space. And if we weren't careful, we might lose ourselves completely. I turned back toward the hallway, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The flickering light seemed to dim with each passing second, and the shadows stretched longer, twisting into grotesque forms. And then, something even more unsettling happened. The students, the ones we had seen in the hallucination, they were back. But now, they weren't just specters of the past. They were standing in front of us, their faces twisted in silent anguish. Their eyes hollow, pleading. "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, this can't be real." Peter looked at me, his face a mixture of terror and disbelief. "It's happening again. They're stuck here, aren't they?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The ghostly figures of the children stood motionless, staring, their presence suffocating the air. And I realized, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that these weren't just echoes of the past. They were trapped here, just like us, caught in the loop of time, unable to escape. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting in impossible directions. I could hear the faint sound of a bell ringing, but there was no clock. No source of time. The minutes, the hours, they didn't seem to exist anymore. Time was becoming meaningless. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the cold wall. It was solid, but at the same time, it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, though no one was there. I felt dizzy, unsteady. The line between what was real and what wasn't was blurring. "Is this a dream?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Am I still asleep?" Emma's eyes met mine, her face pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as if she couldn't find the words either. There was only one thing left to do. We had to get out. Whatever this place was, whatever it was doing to us, we had to escape. but I wasn't sure anymore if we could. Time had broken, reality had shattered, and what we were facing now was something we might never fully understand. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my thoughts. But the hallucinations didn't stop. They never stopped. The air was damp, thick with a sense of decay as we moved deeper into the bowels of the school. The flickering light from our flashlights cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls, distorting shapes and heightening the tension in my chest. Every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence, each footfall a reminder that we were not alone in this place. We had been searching for what felt like hours, stumbling through abandoned classrooms, storage rooms, and hallways that twisted in ways that defied logic. Each corner turned revealed more of the same, crumbling walls, broken desks, and scattered debris. But then, we found it. Emma was the first to notice the trapdoor. It was small, hidden beneath a layer of dust and debris in a forgotten corner of what appeared to be an old janitor's closet. At first, we thought it was just another rotting piece of the school's forgotten infrastructure, but something about it felt different. Something about the way it seemed to beckon us. "Hey, come look at this," Emma's voice broke through the stillness. We gathered around her as she crouched down, brushing aside the layers of dust to reveal a rusted iron handle. The trapdoor was old, worn, and had clearly been untouched for years, but it was still there, waiting. My heart started to race as I knelt beside her, feeling an odd pull toward it. This was something we hadn't expected to find, something that shouldn't have been here at all. Peter reached out, gripping the handle. It squealed as he pulled it, a harsh screech that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The door creaked open, revealing a dark void beneath. For a moment, none of us moved. We simply stared into the inky blackness below, unsure of what to expect. But the silence was oppressive, the air stale, as if it had been sealed off from the world above for far too long. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you think we should go down there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's the only place left we haven't explored," Peter said, his voice tinged with a nervous excitement. "We need to know what's down there." I nodded, but I didn't feel sure of myself. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on my chest, but we had come too far to turn back now. We had to see this through, no matter what we found. One by one, we descended into the darkness. The stairway was narrow, the air colder the further we went down. The walls were made of stone, damp and slick with age, and the smell of mold and decay filled my lungs with every breath. My flashlight flickered, casting long, haunting shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a small, underground room. The floor was uneven, the air thick with an unsettling heaviness. I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, as though it were alive, breathing with us. "God, what is this place?" Emma muttered, her voice low and fearful. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were lined with shelves, their contents obscured by dust and cobwebs. But what drew my attention was the floor. There, partially buried beneath years of dirt and debris, were remnants, bones. Fragments of what could have once been human bodies, scattered and buried haphazardly beneath the layers of earth. The ground itself had been disturbed, clotted, as though something, or someone, had tried to hide these remains. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Who would do this?" Peter's voice trembled, disbelief in every word. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want to have an answer. We all stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the remains. The room felt colder, and a chill seeped into my bones. The unmistakable, horrifying realization hit me: this wasn't just an abandoned school. This place had been hiding something terrible. Emma kneeled down, brushing away the dirt from one of the bones. As her hand made contact with it, a low, almost inaudible sound reverberated through the room. It was a whisper, a voice, barely perceptible, but unmistakably human. "Help!" My blood ran cold. I could barely breathe, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. I looked at my companions. They were as pale as I felt, staring at the remains with wide, horrified eyes. But it wasn't just the bones that haunted me now. It was the whisper. The voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We had uncovered something we weren't meant to find. Something buried deep within the school's dark past. And now, it was beginning to reach out to us. I forced myself to look away from the bones, scanning the room. There were more. The longer I stared, the more I saw small, faint markings on the walls, crude symbols carved into the stone, almost as if they had been scratched in desperation. My mind raced. What were these? Do you think this has anything to do with the ghosts? Emma asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. But the truth was becoming clear. The ghosts weren't just spirits trapped in this place, they were victims. Children, students of this school, who had been lost to something dark and horrible. And now, they weren't content with being just memories. They were reaching out, trying to pull us into their world. Whatever happened here, I began, but my voice faltered. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was something worse. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around. My heart leapt into my throat, but when I swung my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing, just the walls, the dark room, and the cold, oppressive silence. But I knew now we were not alone. The room felt suffocating as we stared at the remnants of what could only be described as the school's darkest secrets. The bones, scattered haphazardly on the floor, still haunted my thoughts, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to uncover more of the terrible truth hidden beneath the walls of this forsaken place. We couldn't stop now. We had to know. Emma, who had been kneeling by the remains, stood up suddenly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "There's more," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Come look at this." We gathered around her as she pointed to an old, withered filing cabinet hidden behind a pile of debris. It looked like it had been untouched for years, the metal rusted and dented, but the handles were still intact. We had barely noticed it when we first entered the room, but now it seemed like it might hold the answers we desperately sought. With a grunt of effort, Peter pried open the cabinet. The metal screeched in protest, but after a moment of struggle, the drawer slid open to reveal a stack of old papers, brittle and yellowed with age. The smell of mildew was overpowering as we pulled the papers free, each sheet fragile, as though they might crumble to dust with the slightest touch. I glanced at the top sheet and froze. It was a school document, official looking, but the contents were anything but ordinary. The paper was filled with strange symbols, disjointed handwriting, and annotations that made no sense. There were references to Subject 47, the experiment, and results inconclusive. "What the hell is this?" I muttered under my breath, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. Peter leaned in, his face pale. They look like medical records, but they're about students. Why would anyone keep something like this? I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the text. The documents detailed numerous students, some of whom had disappeared during what seemed to be an ongoing series of bizarre psychological and physical experiments conducted on them, experiments that were carried out in secret by the very school that now stood before us, decaying and forgotten. Emma's voice shook as she read aloud from one of the documents. Subject 47, a 10-year-old male student, has demonstrated heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli following a series of isolation sessions. Preliminary results suggest increased susceptibility to auditory hallucinations, visual distortions, and psychic phenomena. She looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. They were experimenting on kids. I didn't need to read further to know the implications of what we had found. The school had been a laboratory of sorts, a place where children had been subjected to cruel, unethical experiments, experiments that aimed to tap into the supernatural, to manipulate the mind, to bend reality itself. The ghosts we had encountered were not just spirits, they were the remnants of children who had been torn apart by forces beyond their understanding, their bodies left to rot while their souls remained trapped in a twisted limbo, forever bound to the school. "We have to keep reading," Peter insisted, his voice frantic. "There's more here. We can't stop now. We need to know what happened to them." I couldn't bring myself to argue. I had to know, too. I needed to understand how we had ended up in this nightmare, what had turned this once ordinary school into a place of such horror. So, we kept reading, page after page, each more disturbing than the last. The documents revealed a chilling truth: the experiments had escalated over the years. The children had been subjected to increasing doses of drugs, isolation, and psychological manipulation. They had been made to experience hallucinations, forced to confront their darkest fears, all in the name of some twisted research. The goal, it seemed, was to push the children beyond their breaking point, to unlock some hidden potential deep within the human mind. But the results had been catastrophic. The final report was the most damning of all. It described a final experiment, one that had gone horribly wrong. It spoke of a ritual, an unholy ceremony performed in the basement of the school, using the children as unwilling participants. The purpose of the ritual was to open a doorway, to tear a rift between this world and something other. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. This is what they were doing. They weren't just testing them, they were trying to open a door. A doorway to what? Emma held up one last document, her hand shaking as she read the final entry aloud. Experiment terminated. Subjects lost. The door cannot be closed. They are still here. The words echoed in my mind, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the children who had been trapped in this nightmare, the door was still open. And whatever had been unleashed that night was still here with us. We were no longer just investigating the ghosts of these children, we were part of the experiment now. And the door, whatever it was still waiting to claim us. We had barely finished reading the last of the documents when the atmosphere around us began to shift. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. A low hum started in the walls, barely audible at first, but gradually growing louder. I could feel my heart race as the temperature in the room dropped. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice at first. Emma was still staring at the pages, her fingers trembling as she read aloud in a hushed voice, trying to make sense of the words. Peter stood by the window, peering into the darkness outside, his face pale, his brow furrowed in confusion. I felt a sudden, deep unease that crawled up my spine. Then it happened. A whisper. Soft at first, like a breeze, but unmistakable. My name. Eli. I froze. I knew it wasn't anyone from our group. I turned toward Emma and Peter, but neither of them had heard it. They were too absorbed in their own thoughts. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Eli, come closer." My pulse quickened. The air around me grew colder, the hum turning into a low, distorted voice. The room began to darken, despite the faint light from our flashlights. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting in the corners of the room. Something was wrong. Something was there, but I couldn't see it. A sudden movement caught my eye. A dark shape, flickering at the edge of my vision. It was a figure, just a silhouette, standing by the door. A child, but not a child. The face was distorted, hollowed out, eyes wide and empty, as if it had been drained of all life. My breath hitched in my throat. "Eli, come play with us." The voice was sweet, but there was an edge to it. A kind of hunger that made my blood run cold. Without thinking, my body reacted. I stepped back, but the figure was already moving toward me. I could feel the darkness pushing against me, pulling me in. My feet felt heavy, like I was walking through thick mud. The figure stepped closer, its hands reaching out. Its fingers were long, unnaturally thin, twitching as it beckoned me forward. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, caught in the spell of its gaze, drawn to the darkness behind it. "Come closer, Eli. We've been waiting for you." The words felt like a weight in my chest, like they were pulling at my very soul. The room seemed to blur, the edges of reality starting to fray. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was lost in those eyes, those hollow, endless eyes. And then, out of nowhere, I heard Emma's voice. "Eli." "No." With a sudden force, she grabbed my arm and yanked me back. The spell shattered, and I gasped for air as if I had been drowning. The shadow flickered, but I could still hear its voice, faint but persistent. "You will come." Peter rushed forward, his hand on my shoulder, shaking me. "Eli, are you okay? What the hell just happened?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was still too shaken by the sheer power of what I had felt. The weight of the presence that had nearly consumed me. My mind raced to process what had just occurred. That was no illusion. That wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. Emma looked around, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that? The voice?" I nodded, still unable to speak. The child, that thing, had wanted me to follow it. To step into the dark and be swallowed by it. But something had stopped me. Was it Emma pulling me away, or was it something else? Had I been saved by the force of my own will? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was not safe. We were all trapped in something far worse than we had realized, something that wanted us, needed us. Peter turned to the others. "We need to get out of here. Now." I wanted to agree, but as I looked back toward the door, the darkness seemed to pulse with life. The air was thick with dread, and the walls, once just empty, now felt alive, watching us. The echo of the voice still lingered, and I knew, with a cold certainty, that this was only the beginning. The school was awake, and it would not let us leave. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to force my legs to move, to run, but it felt as if I were wading through molasses. The weight of the darkness pressing in around me was unbearable. The air was thick, suffocating, and each breath felt harder to take than the last. My mind raced, but it couldn't catch up with the terror that surged through me. Run. Emma's voice sliced through the fog in my mind, pulling me back to reality. I could hear her, but I couldn't feel her. My body was betraying me. The shadow, that thing, was still lingering in the corners of my mind, its voice echoing in my skull. Please, I whispered, barely able to choke out the words. I can't. I can't. I tried to step forward, to force myself to move, but the ground felt as if it was shifting beneath my feet. The walls around us seemed to close in, the dim light from our flashlights casting strange, jittery shadows that stretched far too long. The faint, wet sound of footsteps echoed, but I was sure no one else was moving. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in short, sharp bursts. The school was alive. It was breathing, waiting, watching us. Eli, the voice called again, low and raspy. I could feel it curling around my thoughts, worming its way into my mind, sinking deeper, making it harder to think straight. It wanted me. Eli, come back. We've been waiting. No. No. I couldn't let it pull me back in. I had to keep moving. Had to get out. My legs finally responded, but they felt like they were moving through cement. But as I stumbled forward, my head spun. The world seemed to bend and twist. The hallway in front of me stretched longer than it should have, the walls warping and groaning as if they were alive, shifting with each step I took. Keep going. Emma shouted again, but her voice sounded far away, distorted. Her image blurred at the edges as I glanced back toward her. Was she even there? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. But everything was moving in slow motion, the lights flickering erratically. The hum, that maddening hum, had returned, louder this time, vibrating in my chest. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the sounds of whispers merging into a single low drone that surrounded me. I could feel it creeping inside me, pulling me under. Was I losing my mind? I stumbled into a classroom, its door creaking open of its own accord, as if inviting me to step inside. The room was empty, save for a desk in the corner, piled with more papers. But they weren't just papers. The faces, I could see them now, scrawled in the margins of the pages, children's faces, twisted in agony. Their eyes were wide, staring at me. Watching. My breathing came fast and shallow. I had to get out. Had to. A sudden crash echoed through the room, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. The lights flickered again, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow. My pulse pounded in my ears. Something moved. I turned, and there it was. The shadow. It was back, standing in the doorway, but this time it wasn't just a figure. It was a child, a little girl. Her eyes were wide and empty, her skin pale and cracked, as though she had been left to rot long ago. She reached out toward me with long, spindly fingers, her lips twisting into a grotesque smile. Come, play with us. Eli, her voice was sweet, too sweet, like honey laced with poison. The room spun around me, and my knees buckled. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, trying to steady myself. My vision blurred, and the walls seemed to close in. I could hear Emma's voice, faint and distant, calling my name, but I couldn't reach her. My hands trembled as I clawed at the floor, trying to push myself up, but it felt as though the very ground had become a part of the nightmare. The shadow loomed closer, its voice growing louder, the words tangled in a garbled whisper that seemed to wrap around my skull like chains. You can't leave. You belong to us now, No, no, I couldn't stay. I couldn't let it take me. But my thoughts were slipping like sand through my fingers. I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tried to crawl toward the door, but the air was so thick, so oppressive, I couldn't breathe. My body felt numb, detached, as though it were no longer mine. I was losing myself. I could hear Emma's voice again, this time louder, closer. Eli. Eli, we need to get out of here. I managed to drag myself across the floor, but the room around me kept shifting. The shadows twisted and writhed, like something was alive within them. Every time I reached for the door, the distance between me and the exit seemed to grow longer. The school was playing tricks on me, messing with my perception of time and space. I was losing my grip. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. The reflection in the window. My own face. But it wasn't me. My eyes were wide, hollow, like the children in the pictures. I reached up to touch my face, but the reflection didn't move when I did. I was already gone. A scream built in my throat, but it never came out. The world around me folded in on itself, and the shadows closed in, swallowing me whole. I felt the cold hands of the darkness wrap around my wrists, pulling me back toward it. It was too late. I had already been claimed. I felt a strange heaviness in the pit of my stomach, like I was being crushed under the weight of something I couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was something deeper. Something that gnawed at the edges of my mind, pulling at the seams of reality itself. We were no longer just researchers in an abandoned school. We were part of something much larger, something much darker than any of us had anticipated. It wasn't just the history of the place that was twisted, it was the very fabric of our existence here, now. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't simply investigating the horrors of this place, we were entangled in them. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the flickering light above me casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The others were scattered around, still trying to piece together what was happening, but I could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed. Emma's voice cut through the silence. Eli, you're not the same, she said, her tone uncertain, filled with worry. We're connected to this place, aren't we? I turned to look at her, her face pale and drawn, the fear in her eyes mirroring my own. I didn't want to acknowledge what she was saying, but I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something in the way the school seemed to bend time and space, in the way our footsteps echoed too loudly, that made it impossible to ignore. We weren't here by chance. We had been chosen. As if on cue, a cold shiver ran down my spine. A sharp, unnatural breeze swept through the corridor, carrying with it the faintest whisper, so faint, in fact, that I almost didn't hear it. You are one of us now. The voice was distant, like it was coming from far below the ground, as if the walls themselves were speaking. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place by the weight of those words. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. The strange connections between us, the way we all seemed to have known something without saying it, the way the school's malevolent presence felt like it had been waiting for us. We were here for a reason. We were bound to these ghosts, these tortured souls who had never left. And somehow, we had become a part of their story, trapped in the web they wove. My voice faltered. I remember now. I remember why we're here. It's not just research. We're being used. We're being pulled into this. No. Emma's voice quivered with disbelief. She stepped back, shaking her head. It can't be true. We were just supposed to uncover the truth, not become a part of it. But the truth was staring us right in the face. The photographs, the documents, the whispers that had grown louder with each passing hour. The school was alive, yes, but not in the way we had imagined. It was more than a haunting, it was a trap, a prison. And we had unknowingly walked right into it. I looked at the others. They were as lost as I was, eyes wide with fear, but there was no escape. The very air around us felt thicker, like it was tightening with every breath we took. There was no way out. The doors, the windows, they had all been sealed shut by them. The spirits of the children, now forever tied to this place, had been waiting for us. Waiting for the moment when we would realize that we were no longer separate from them. We have to find a way to stop it, I said, my voice shaking as I looked at the others. But I knew deep down that it was too late. The connection had already been made. And now, we were as much a part of the school as the ghosts who wandered its halls. A loud crash echoed from the nearby classroom, and we all jumped. I could hear faint laughter, distant, echoing through the halls, a sound that was both playful and cruel. They want us to stay, Emma whispered. They want us, like they wanted the others. It was true. We were part of the school now. And no matter how hard we tried, there was no escaping the past, no running from what we had become. A sudden clarity washed over me, like the weight of the truth had just slammed into me all at once. I realized what we had done. By entering this cursed place, we had bound ourselves to it. We were now witnesses, participants in the unfinished story of these lost souls. And the worst part? We weren't just here to uncover the past, we were part of it. Forever. The weight of the truth pressed down on us like a suffocating cloud, making each breath feel heavier, each step more uncertain. The walls of the school seemed to close in, pressing against us, urging us to stay, but we couldn't. We had to leave. The atmosphere was thick with the presence of those who had died here, and the deeper we went into the school, the more we could feel their pull, like invisible hands tugging at our minds, holding us back. We need to get out. Emma's voice was strained, panic creeping into her words as she looked around the dimly lit corridor. Now, it wasn't just fear, it was something else, something primal that told us to run before it was too late. There was no time to think, no time to waste. We had to escape. We rushed to the main doors, only to find them locked. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, but it didn't budge. I yanked again, more violently this time, but the door remained solid, like it had been sealed shut by an unseen force. Damn it! I cursed under my breath, stepping back. My mind raced. How could it be? The door had been open when we arrived. It had to be something supernatural, something that wanted us to stay. There has to be another way out, Johan muttered, his voice tight with fear, but there was no time to argue. We had to try everything. The windows, the back doors, the cellar. We moved quickly, moving from one exit to the next, only to find them all locked, barred, or inexplicably closed. The feeling of being trapped, of being hunted, only grew stronger the longer we stayed in the school. We didn't know it yet, but we were running out of time. Someone, was waiting for us. Suddenly, I heard a soft shuffle behind us. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned, half expecting to see one of the shadowy figures or the flickering lights that had plagued us since we arrived. But it was worse. It was worse because it was real. Jonah had stopped in his tracks, his face frozen in a mixture of confusion and terror. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. But before any of us could respond, he took a step backward, looking over his shoulder as though he could sense something we couldn't. Then, in an instant, he was gone. One moment, Jonah was there, standing a few feet away from me, and the next, he vanished into thin air. There was no noise, no scream, no cry for help. Just a sudden, horrifying silence. I froze, my mind unable to process what had just happened. One moment, he had been with us, and the next, nothing. "Jonah!" Emma screamed, rushing forward, her face pale with terror. "Jonah!" I could see her reaching into the empty space where he had been, her fingers grasping at thin air as though she could pull him back. But there was nothing to hold on to. The air around her felt colder, denser, as though the school itself had swallowed him whole. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared, but it felt different this time. More final. The fear in Emma's eyes reflected my own. "He's gone," I whispered, the words thick with disbelief. "Where did he go?" she asked, her voice shaking as she turned to face me. But the question didn't have an answer. There was no logical explanation. Jonah had been here, alive, and then, nothing. The air seemed to pulse around us, heavy with an unnatural tension, and for the first time since we entered the school, I truly felt the weight of the danger we were in. We weren't just dealing with the supernatural. We were dealing with something that played by no rules, no boundaries of time or space. The school was alive in ways I hadn't even begun to understand. "We need to move," I said, my voice firm now, despite the fear that surged in my veins. "We can't just stand here." But even as I spoke, I felt a sudden, chilling realization there was no way out. Not anymore. Jonah had disappeared, and the rest of us, we were next. We had to survive. But I wasn't sure how much longer any of us could. The air around us felt suffocating, thick with the weight of Jonah's disappearance. The walls of the school seemed to press in on me from all sides, and every sound, every creak and groan of the building, twisted in my mind, turning into a harbinger of something far worse than I had ever imagined. I tried to push the fear aside, but it clung to me like a second skin. I had always thought of myself as someone who could keep a cool head in a crisis, but now, as the school closed in around us, I could feel my grip on reality beginning to slip. I had seen strange things before, things I couldn't explain, but they had always been fleeting, visions that could be explained away by my mind playing tricks. But not this. Not Jonah's disappearance. Not the way everything now felt like a lie, like a trap I couldn't escape. The silence that followed his vanishing was the loudest thing I ever heard. It felt like the whole school was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to make the next move. Every step I took now felt heavy. I looked around, half expecting shadows to stretch and warp into something monstrous, something that would follow me no matter where I went. I could still hear the faintest echo of Jonah's voice in my mind, calling out to me from the darkness. But no, he was gone. He wasn't coming back. I tried to breathe. I tried to stay calm. But the panic gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, waiting for the perfect moment to break through. "Did you hear that?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, sharp with fear. I nodded, my eyes flicking nervously toward the source of the sound. At first, it had been just a faint rustling, like a wind blowing through the broken windows. But now it was something else, something far too distinct to ignore. The soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on wood. It was the sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, moving just beyond the edge of the hallway. My heart began to race. I had heard those steps before when we had been searching for Jonah. At first, they seemed harmless, almost natural. But now, they felt like a warning. A warning that the school was still hunting us, like the ghosts that wandered these halls were slowly closing in. I closed my eyes, trying to ground myself in the present. I tried to remind myself that it was just the old building settling, just the wind playing tricks on my ears. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far more sinister. I opened my eyes, but all I could see were shadows dancing along the walls, their shapes twisting and stretching like they were alive. There it was again, faint, deliberate steps, this time louder, closer. The air in the hallway grew colder, and I could feel my breath hitch in my throat. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. This was real. The school had become alive in ways I couldn't explain, its very walls alive with malevolent energy. "Please, we have to get out," Emma said, her voice cracking as she grabbed my arm. She was trembling, just like I was. I nodded, but it felt like the words were hollow, like they meant nothing. It didn't matter how fast we moved now. No matter how hard we ran, we were trapped in this nightmare. As we hurried through the corridor, the tapping grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from within the walls, as though something, someone, was crawling behind them, moving in time with us. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam flickering in the dim light as I scanned the dark hallway. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound I couldn't place, but it sent a chill down my spine. The hum grew louder, echoing through the halls, until it felt like the very building was alive, thrumming with some terrible energy. And then, through the haze of fear and confusion, I heard something else. A voice. Soft at first, a whisper, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. "You can't escape." The voice was chilling, but not unfamiliar. It was the same voice I had heard when we first arrived, when Jonah had vanished. It was the same voice that had whispered to us, calling us into the depths of the school. I froze, my body locking in place as the words echoed in my mind. I wanted to deny it, wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the truth was undeniable. The school was alive. It was pulling us in, one by one, and there was no way out. I turned to Emma, my face pale with terror. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop." But she was already staring ahead, her face frozen in fear. The shadows in the hallways seemed to be growing, moving, twisting into figures that were too solid to be just tricks of the light. I could hear them now, footsteps, tapping, shuffling, coming from all directions. And with each step I took, I felt myself slipping further away from the world I knew, further away from the safety I had taken for granted. It was all slipping away, and there was no way to stop it. We had been running for what felt like hours, though time had become meaningless in this place. The walls seemed to shift, as if the very building was warping around us. We couldn't tell where we were anymore. The hallways twisted like a labyrinth, every door we passed leading to another dead end. No matter how many turns we made, the way out remained elusive, just out of reach. The air was thick with tension, every step we took echoing in the vast, empty school. The flickering lights above us cast long shadows, distorting the space and making it feel like we were being haunted. Every sound now seemed to carry the weight of something sinister. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the walls, felt like a warning. We were being watched. I could feel it in my bones. Emma, who had been the most composed of us all, now stumbled with each step. Her eyes darted nervously around the dark corridors, constantly shifting as though she were searching for an escape that wasn't there. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her face was ashen, twisted with the same fear I was trying to keep buried deep within me. "We can't keep running like this," she said, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, desperately searching for a plan. My thoughts were jumbled, and the very concept of time felt like it had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The world around me was warping, flickering lights, moving shadows, whispers that had once been indistinguishable were now clear as day. We had entered a place that no longer obeyed any laws of physics or reason. The deeper we went, the more impossible it seemed to find our way out. "Look around," I finally said, my voice rising. "We have to focus. We need to stick together." It was a lie. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, clawing at me. But I couldn't let Emma see it. I couldn't let her see the doubt creeping in, threatening to suffocate me. Suddenly, there was a sharp, guttural cry from behind us. We all froze. The sound came again, closer now, a shrill wail that cut through the silence like a knife. "Jonah!" Emma screamed, rushing back in the direction the sound had come from. I grabbed her arm. "No! Emma, don't!" But it was too late. She was already pulling away, desperate, the fear in her eyes pushing her forward, against all reason. I had no choice but to follow, a sick feeling in my stomach as I ran after her. We rounded a corner and came to an abrupt halt. Ahead of us, Jonah's body lay sprawled across the floor. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, his mouth frozen in a scream that would never escape. But it wasn't Jonah anymore. His form was distorted, twisted in ways that didn't make sense. His limbs bent at unnatural angles, and his skin was pulled taut across his bones, pale and ghostly. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faintest whisper of his voice could be heard, muffled, as if trying to speak from beyond the grave. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, a sob caught in her throat. I could barely breathe. This was no longer the world we knew. This was something else, something far darker, a place where death wasn't an end, but a beginning. "Is this him?" Emma gasped, her voice breaking. I stepped forward, my legs trembling beneath me, trying to summon the strength to face whatever this was. But as I approached Jonah's body, his twisted, unrecognizable form, everything inside me screamed to run. "Don't look at it," I whispered, gripping Emma's arm harder. But it was too late. She was already staring, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the sight of what Jonah had become. I can't leave him here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I pulled her back, urgency rising in my chest. "We don't have time for this. We need to get out, now." But something was pulling at me, a feeling deeper than fear, something that clawed at my mind like a forgotten memory trying to break free. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping with each second. I turned slowly, only to find the shadows around us shifting, forming into figures that weren't quite human. Their shapes flickered, indistinct, as if they were trying to manifest themselves fully, but were unable to. The whispering started again, louder now, growing into a cacophony of voices, voices that sounded like they were coming from every direction. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, pulsing with the rhythm of the sound. We were not alone. And then I saw it, the figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A child, its face obscured by a veil of darkness, its small hand outstretched as if beckoning us. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Emma forward, my legs moving on their own as I scrambled to escape. But we were too late. The shadows closed in around us, filling the hallway with a suffocating darkness. The whispers grew louder, now filled with urgency, with promises of something that we could not begin to understand. And in that moment, as the walls seemed to collapse inward and the air grew thick with the presence of something ancient, I realized the truth. The school wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was alive. And it had been waiting for us. The fight for survival had just begun. The hallway was suffocating. The air around us felt thick, dense, as though it was pushing against our very souls. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than the last, filling the space with a sense of impending doom. But there was something more. Something I couldn't explain. I turned to Emma, my chest tight with fear, and saw that she was staring at something in the distance. Her eyes were wide, locked on a figure in the shadows at the far end of the corridor. It was there again, only this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a child, but not a child in the way we would recognize. This figure was wrong, too still, too perfect, like it had been carved out of the darkness itself. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see it?" She nodded, but her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She wasn't scared anymore, she was something else, something I didn't recognize. Her eyes were glazed over, as though something inside her had snapped. She took a slow step forward, her movements deliberate, as if drawn to the figure like a moth to a flame. I reached out to grab her arm, pulling her back. "Emma, don't. We have to get out of here. This place, this thing isn't real." But she wasn't listening. Her hand was outstretched, her fingers trembling as if trying to touch the shadow. My heart raced in my chest as I saw the figure slowly raise its hand in response. I could feel the cold of the air, the presence of the thing, getting closer. It was like the walls themselves were alive, bending and shifting as the child's shape flickered in and out of focus. The whispers, the voices that had been haunting us, grew louder, more insistent. And then I realized what was happening. "No," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. "It's trying to pull us in. It wants us. It's trying to tie us to this place." Emma turned to look at me, her eyes glassy. "We can't leave. We were always meant to be here. All of us." My stomach turned. The words didn't make sense, yet they felt so real. They felt like they were echoing something I had forgotten, a memory buried deep in my mind, one I couldn't quite grasp. The shadowy figure, the child, was slowly stepping closer now. I could hear the soft padding of its footsteps, faint as they were, but the more it moved, the more I felt it in my chest, a pressure, as though it were trying to push its way into my very being. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became indistinguishable from the sound of my own heartbeat. "This place, it's not letting us go," I muttered, my voice barely audible. The shadows seemed to grow larger, the child now clearly visible, its face hidden beneath a dark veil of hair. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. Its form seemed to shift, the edges of its body blurring as though it were part of the very darkness it was born from. I felt Emma's grip tighten on my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, pulling me closer to the child. The whispers were clearer now, almost like words. "Join us. Become one with us." I yanked my arm away, stumbling back. "No." "We're not joining you." But the child didn't stop. It kept coming, its pale hand now reaching toward us. The whispers were becoming overwhelming, as though the very walls of the school were pressing in on me. "You will stay with us." I realized, with a sickening jolt, what the school wanted. It wasn't just about trapping us in its walls, it wanted to tie us to it. To make us part of the curse. To make us one with the souls of the children who had never left. I grabbed Emma by the shoulders, shaking her, trying to bring her back. "Emma, listen to me. You're not one of them. This is not real." But the emptiness in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She was already slipping away. The pull of the school, the ghosts, the curse, it was too strong. Suddenly, the air grew colder. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something were pulling at my soul, trying to drag me into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind with images of the past, of children long gone, of a place that had consumed them all. The child stopped in front of us, its face still hidden, but I could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me. The connection was being made, something ancient, something evil was reaching out, trying to claim us. "Get away from her!" I screamed, shoving Emma away from the child, trying to break the connection that was slowly tightening around her. But it was too late. She was already slipping into its grasp. The shadows thickened around us, and I realized there was no escape. The ghosts weren't just haunting the school. They were trying to drag us into their world, to make us their own. The cycle would never end. And in that moment, I knew that the real horror wasn't just the ghosts of the children. It was the school itself, the living, breathing thing that had been waiting for us to join it. The air inside the school had grown thick, as though it were saturated with some unseen pressure, something malevolent that weighed down on us. We were no longer in control of ourselves, of each other, of our fate. The walls seemed to shift and close in around us, trapping us further with every passing moment. We stumbled through the dark, my hands shaking as I clung to the beam of my flashlight. My mind felt numb, everything slipping through my fingers like sand. Emma had disappeared, taken, swallowed up by the shadows, and the rest of us were left to scramble for a way out. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, but they weren't ours. I felt my heart leap into my throat as I turned, hoping for a glimpse of the others, but instead, I was met by something far worse. Liam, one of the researchers, was standing at the end of the corridor, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth moved, but no words came out. He was staring at something just beyond my line of sight. A faint whisper reached my ears, too faint to make out, but it was enough to freeze me in place. And then, in an instant, everything seemed to happen at once. The floor beneath our feet seemed to tremble, the lights flickering on and off, and the cold grew unbearable. I heard Liam scream, the sound of it so raw, so full of fear, that it made my blood run cold. His body jerked as though something unseen was pulling him forward, dragging him toward the center of the hallway where the shadows seemed to thicken. "Liam!" I shouted, but my voice sounded distant, almost as if I were underwater. I rushed toward him, but as I did, the ground beneath me seemed to crack open, sending a shock of panic through my chest. Something was wrong, everything was wrong. The world around me was warping, and I couldn't tell where the nightmare ended and reality began. I reached out to grab Liam's arm, but he was yanked away from me with a speed that defied explanation. "Liam! No!" I screamed, reaching out, my hands grasping nothing but air. And then, in an instant, the room fell silent. The shadows receded, and Liam was gone. He hadn't disappeared, he had been ripped away, as if the darkness itself had swallowed him whole. I stood frozen, breath coming in ragged gasps, heart hammering in my chest. The echoes of his screams still rang in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still here, watching us, waiting for the rest of us to fall. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss. The danger was still here, thick in the air like smoke, and we needed to get out. But every direction we turned led us deeper into the maze, deeper into the heart of this nightmare. The school, the ghosts, the darkness, it all felt so suffocating now, like it was alive and it was playing with us. "Where do we go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt hollow, pointless, as if the question itself was a futile attempt to cling to something solid. "We have to leave," said Sarah, her voice trembling. She was the last one left with me, and I could see the same dread in her eyes that was tearing through me. We had lost two of our own, and now we were down to just the two of us, no answers, no way out. But the door at the end of the hallway, the one that had been locked before, was now open. My heart raced. Could this be a chance? Was this our way out? Or was it a trap? We had no choice. We had to try. We ran, hearts pounding, but as we crossed the threshold, the world around us seemed to warp again, the edges of the room blurring as though reality itself was unraveling. And then, as if on cue, Sarah screamed. She was dragged back, pulled into the dark by unseen hands. I reached out, desperate to save her, but my fingers brushed only air. She was gone. The darkness swallowed her whole. And I was alone. The door slammed shut behind me, leaving me in the silence of that forsaken school. My mind spun, disoriented, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was the only one left. I couldn't see the way out, couldn't feel the escape anymore. The whispers were all around me now, closing in, not just from the walls, but from within me. I couldn't escape the truth. This place had already claimed me, and there was nothing left but to join those who had already been lost. The silence in the school was suffocating, as though the very air around me had thickened, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. The hallway stretched before me, dark and endless, with no sign of life except the relentless whispers that crept at the edges of my mind. The weight of what had happened, the disappearance of my team, the inexplicable horrors that had unfolded, crushed me from the inside out. I tried to rationalize it. I had to. The only way to survive in a place like this was to find some explanation, some way to make sense of the madness. I thought about everything we had witnessed, the voices, the shadows, the bodies that had been lost. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. This was no ordinary place. No abandoned school. It had been something else long before we ever set foot inside. There was power here, a force so ancient and dark that it transcended the limits of human understanding. This wasn't just a school. It was a trap, a net woven with the spirits of the past, luring in anyone foolish enough to try and uncover its secrets. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing as I replayed every moment. The doors had been locked, but now they were open. The shadows had come to life, whispering and calling, leading us deeper into their realm. And now, with Sarah gone, with Liam and the others lost to the darkness, it was clear to me. I wasn't going to leave. The thought struck me with a sickening finality. The idea of escape, of survival, had slipped through my fingers long ago. I was no longer part of the world I had once known. This place had claimed me as much as it had claimed my friends. We had walked in here as strangers, and we would leave as nothing but echoes, trapped in the walls of this cursed building. There was no way out. There had never been a way out. The school, the ghosts, the whispers, they weren't just phenomena. They were the school. The building itself was alive, feeding off our fear, our memories, our very essence. I stumbled forward, my body trembling as I walked deeper into the heart of the school. Each step felt like I was sinking further into quicksand, each breath harder to take. I wasn't sure if I was even walking anymore, or if the walls themselves were pushing me along, dragging me towards some inevitable end. But there was something else. A sense of awareness, something cold and unseen, lurking just beyond my vision. The whispers were louder now, no longer whispers, but voices, voices of children, of teachers, of the lost. They called to me, not in words but in emotions, in memories I didn't recognize but somehow felt. I stopped, my hand pressed against the wall for support, my legs shaky beneath me. And then I saw it, a figure, a shadow, standing just ahead. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't human. It was one of them. One of the souls trapped in this forsaken place, waiting for its next victim. It was then that I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I wasn't meant to leave. I had never been meant to leave. The school wasn't simply holding us captive, it was calling us home. And I had answered its call. The figure stepped closer, its form twisting in the dim light. I could see the outline of a child, no older than 10, wearing a faded uniform. The face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and accusing. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The ghosts weren't just random spirits. They were former students, trapped in this hell, and now they were coming for me, for all of us. But what happened to the others? Had they already succumbed? Or were they still here, waiting, just like me, for the inevitable to come? I turned to run, but the darkness was closing in, wrapping around me, suffocating me. There was no escape. The school had claimed me, just as it had claimed the others. There was nothing left to fight for. I was no longer a part of the world outside. I was part of the school now, forever. I felt the cold fingers of the ghost brush against my skin, and in that moment, I knew I was never meant to leave. I had become a part of the school's endless cycle, another lost soul wandering its halls. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized the fatal truth: there was no end. There was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where the whispers would never stop, and the shadows would never fade. The air had grown heavier, thick with the weight of dread and the looming darkness that closed in from all sides. It felt like the very walls of the school were watching, listening, as if the building itself was alive, breathing in unison with my terror. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, each breath a struggle against the crushing pressure. I could hear the whispering again, that soft, guttural murmur that came from everywhere and nowhere. The voices of the lost children, their calls blending with the scratching of old, dry wood, the creaking of doors that would never open. I was alone now, completely alone. The others were gone. Liam, Sarah, Chris, they had all been swallowed by the darkness, victims of the school's insidious pull. How had it happened? How had we let it get this far? But there was no time to think about that now. The last of us, the final investigator, was still here, still fighting against something far beyond our understanding. I was no longer just trying to survive. I was fighting for something more primal now. I was trying to stop it. I had to stop it before it claimed us all. I moved quickly through the corridor, my steps frantic and unsteady. My flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, clawing at the edges of my mind. I ignored it, pushing forward. There had to be a way to stop this, a way to break the cycle, to end the madness. My thoughts raced. What had we missed? What hadn't we seen? We'd found the old records, the dark secrets of this place, but we hadn't understood them, none of us had. Maybe, in our desperation to escape, we had overlooked the truth that was right in front of us. And then it hit me. The ghosts weren't just trapped here. They weren't lingering by accident. They had been drawn to the school, just as we had. The school had been their prison, their torment, and it was trying to repeat the cycle, bringing new souls to join the ones already lost within its walls. That was the pattern. That was what I had missed. The whispers grew louder, angrier, as though the building itself was aware of my discovery. I could feel it now. The building wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It had a hunger. It needed us. It wanted us. And if I didn't act now, it would claim me, too. I turned the corner and found myself in front of the main staircase. It was darker than I remembered, the shadows swallowing the steps as if they led into some unfathomable abyss. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the temperature dropped, so cold I could see my breath in front of me. I could hear them now, more than just whispers. Scratching. Scratching like nails dragging against stone. They were coming closer. I had to stop it. I had to end it before it took me as well. I rushed up the stairs, desperate, my heart pounding in my chest. At the top, I found the old janitor's closet. The door hung ajar, creaking with every passing second. I could feel the presence of something terrible waiting inside, but I forced myself to step forward, each movement a struggle against the paralyzing fear clawing at my mind. Inside the closet, a strange sight met my eyes. It was a collection of objects, some old and broken, others strangely intact, an old mirror, a cracked lamp, tattered books, and something I had only seen in old photographs, a ritualistic candle, still burning with a faint, ghostly light. The flickering flame seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I knew what I had to do. This was the heart of it all, the school's power source, the thing that had bound the spirits to these halls. The rituals. The dark rituals performed by the people who had once run this place. They had summoned something dark and ancient, and it had been feeding on the souls of the children, turning their restless spirits into part of the building itself. I grabbed the candle and threw it into the center of the room. But it didn't break, didn't extinguish. Instead, it flared up, brighter than before, as though my action had only served to fuel it. The temperature dropped even further, and the scratching sounds intensified. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the matches, the flame flickering in the cold, fighting to stay alive. And then the walls began to shake. I didn't know if it was the building quaking in rage or if it was the spirits pushing back against the ritual I was attempting to reverse. But I couldn't stop now. I had to finish what I had started. But then, the world around me seemed to dissolve. The walls stretched and bent, distorting like a nightmare. The hallway disappeared into blackness, and in the distance, I saw them. The children. Their faces twisted in torment, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They were moving toward me, their figures no longer shadowy but solid, tangible. They were real. Real in the most terrifying way. And as they closed in, their fingers reaching for me, I understood with chilling clarity there was no escaping this place. There was no escape from its grip. And as they pulled me into the darkness, I realized the horrible truth. I had failed. The building had won. The last investigator had become the last victim. There would be no survivors. The cycle would continue. And as the darkness closed in, I felt myself fading, slipping into the same endless void where the others had been swallowed. The school had claimed me. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled my ears. And in that moment, I knew there would be no more investigations. No more escape. Only the endless halls. Only the endless echoes of the lost. I could feel it closing in on me, a suffocating presence that had taken root in my mind. The shadows pressed tighter against me, curling like tendrils, wrapping around my body, dragging me back into the bowels of the school. The floor beneath my feet seemed to shift, to warp, as though it were alive, pushing and pulling me in different directions. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the very air itself was working against me. But I had no choice. I couldn't stop now. Not after everything I had seen, after everything that had happened. I had to keep moving. I had to fight, no matter how futile it seemed. The others were gone, but I had one last chance to escape. I turned, hoping for an exit, hoping that somehow, by sheer will, I could find a way out of this nightmare. The hallway ahead of me was darker than I had ever seen it, the flickering lights casting long, jittery shadows. It felt wrong, like a place that was never meant to be. The walls seemed to bend and flex as if the building itself was breathing, shifting in response to my desperation. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They swirled around me, becoming more distinct. I could make out words, fragments of sentences, but they weren't clear. The voices weren't the same as before. These were desperate, begging voices. They were asking for help, pleading for release. And then it hit me. I had been wrong all along. There was no escape. The school wasn't just trapping us physically, it was trapping us mentally. The more I fought, the more I resisted, the deeper I sank into its grasp. I realized now that the school wanted us to escape. It wanted us to find the door. But the door wasn't freedom. It was just another part of the cycle. A trap, disguised as salvation. I had to stop. I had to face what was happening, to face the truth that had been staring me in the face the whole time. I wasn't fighting to escape. I was fighting to survive. I was fighting to keep my mind intact. I reached the door at the end of the hallway. It was the only exit I had seen in hours. The handle was cold to the touch, and as I turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a bright light. The first real light I had seen in what felt like an eternity. For a moment, I thought I had won. The door was there, the light was there. I had found a way out. But as I stepped through, I felt my stomach drop. The light didn't lead outside. It didn't lead to freedom. It led me back. Back to the beginning. I was in the front foyer of the school again, standing right where we had entered. The grand staircase loomed ahead, the same old, dusty staircase that I had climbed hours, maybe days, ago. The same heavy air, the same feeling of suffocating isolation. Nothing had changed. Everything was the same. And yet, it felt worse than before. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, my breath quickening. I looked around, but nothing made sense. The hallway I had just walked down was now completely gone. There were no doors, no windows, just the same cold stone walls. The room stretched on endlessly, as if the school had absorbed every part of reality into itself. The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my pulse racing. I tried to open it again, but the handle was frozen, solid as ice. The whispers were louder now, too close, too real. They were right next to me, in my ears, in my mind. You can't leave. The voice was clear now, a child's voice, but it was chilling. It wasn't a whisper, it was an order. And I knew who it was. It was one of the children, one of the lost souls who had never escaped. A spirit trapped here, bound to the school, cursed to live in this nightmare forever. The walls began to tremble, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, swirling around me. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe, and I knew they were coming for me. This was it. There was no escape. No way out. I ran. My legs moved instinctively, my body pushing through the thick, cold air, my mind barely able to grasp what was happening. I didn't know where I was running to anymore, just away from the shadows that had started to close in on me. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel them behind me, the weight of their gaze, the chilling presence of the dead pressing down on me. I turned corners, pushed through doorways that only led to more endless halls, but I was still trapped. Still lost. Finally, I collapsed to the ground, panting, tears running down my face. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. You should never have come. The voice echoed in my head. It was the voice of the school itself, and I realized now that it wasn't just haunted, it was a living thing, a monstrous, consuming force that thrived on fear, on loss, on those foolish enough to walk through its doors. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, soft at first, but growing louder, closer. And then, darkness. When I woke, I was still in the school. The light from the doorway had disappeared, and I was alone in the oppressive quiet. But now, I knew the truth. There was no escape. The school had claimed me, just as it had claimed everyone before me. And now, it was my turn. The silence was deafening. My mind spun in chaotic spirals, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had become my reality. Every corner I turned, every door I opened, led me deeper into the heart of this cursed school. It felt like I was walking through a maze of forgotten memories, each step echoing the endless passage of time. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the weight of their cold stone suffocating my every breath. I needed answers. I had to understand what was happening. The others were gone. The whispers had gotten louder. There was no escape, no way out of this twisted place. But if I could uncover the truth, maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to break free. I moved through the halls with purpose, the dim light from my flashlight flickering erratically as I walked. The air felt heavier with each passing second, thick with an invisible force that pressed against my chest. It was as if the very school itself was alive, watching me, waiting. Then, I heard it, a soft sound, like a faint, distant hum. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it grew louder. Closer. A melody, but not one I recognized. It was haunting, an eerie tune that seemed to wrap itself around my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I followed the sound, my feet moving without thought, compelled by an unseen force. The hallways seemed endless, stretching and shifting, and the walls began to twist, becoming something unfamiliar, almost alien. I had the distinct feeling that I was no longer walking through a building but through the fabric of the past itself. Then, I saw him. A figure, standing in the center of the hallway. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, another trick of the light. But as I drew closer, I saw him clearly. A child, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform, his face pale and hollow, eyes empty, as though he had long since lost any trace of humanity. He stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for me. The hum stopped abruptly. The air grew still. "You've come," the boy said, his voice a cold whisper that echoed through the hallway. "You're just like the others." I froze, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my body was paralyzed, as if his gaze held me in place. What are you?" I managed to croak, my throat dry, my voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his feet making no sound as they hit the floor. "I am what's left of the school," he said, his voice growing fainter, like a fading memory. "I am what's left of all of them." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the weight of the room press down harder on me. The walls seemed to close in, and the boy's image began to flicker, like a faulty projection. "No," I whispered. "This can't be real. You're not real." But he was real. He was too real. His presence was overwhelming, seeping into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, invading my every sense. The more I tried to push him away, the closer he seemed to get, his form becoming sharper, more defined. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice now inside my head. "Not now. Not ever." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if I was rooted to the floor, trapped in the web of his presence. His eyes, the empty, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt myself falling into them deeper and deeper, as if I were sinking into a bottomless pit. "No!" I screamed, struggling to break free. "I won't be like the others. I won't stay here." The boy's lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. "You already are." And that's when I felt it. A rush, like a wave crashing over me, but it wasn't water. It was the cold grip of the school itself, seeping into my mind, taking hold of my thoughts. I could feel my memories slipping away, one by one, as if they were being erased, as though the school was consuming me, pulling me into its dark, eternal grasp. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream. But it was useless. I could feel my willpower fading, my thoughts slipping away into darkness. The boy was no longer just a figure in front of me. He was in me, his presence consuming every part of my mind. "Stay with me." His voice echoed, not just in my ears, but in my mind, in my soul. And just like that, I was no longer me. I was part of the school now, trapped in its endless nightmare, just like the boy, just like the others who had come before me. The last thing I felt was the cold embrace of the darkness, swallowing me whole. And then, nothing. I was no longer aware of time. It was only when I became aware of the whispers again, so many voices, all speaking at once, that I understood the truth. I had become one of them. I was now a part of the school, just another lost soul wandering its endless halls. There was no escape. There was only the eternal darkness. And I, too, would wait for the next fool to come. To wander too close. To listen to the whispers. And the cycle would continue. Forever. I woke up in the dark. My body ached, as if I had been lying still for years. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim, flickering light around me. The air was thick with dust and the stale, oppressive smell of neglect. It was cold, colder than it had been when I first stepped inside this cursed school. But something was different. The walls were no longer shifting, the sounds of footsteps and whispers had faded into an eerie silence. I was outside? No. I was still within the walls of the school, but it felt different now. The space seemed to stretch and warp in a way I couldn't comprehend. It felt like I had crossed some boundary, a line between worlds. My chest tightened as I realized that what I had experienced before wasn't just a nightmare or a hallucination. This place was a prison, and I had somehow found myself locked within it forever. I staggered to my feet, disoriented, my thoughts in disarray. Where were the others? The others who had come with me, the ones who were lost. Had they too been swallowed up by this place? My hand brushed against the cold stone wall, my fingers trembling as I tried to steady myself. I could feel the weight of something pressing on me, something unseen, like 1,000 invisible eyes watching my every move. I took a step forward, the sound of my shoes echoing loudly in the silence. The hallway stretched before me, the same as it always had, empty, forgotten. But now, I wasn't alone. The shadows around me began to shift, twisting and contorting into figures, faces I had seen before. They were the faces of the lost, the forgotten. The students. Their hollow eyes stared at me with a kind of sadness that gnawed at my soul. "You're one of us now," a voice whispered, not from any one person, but from everywhere. From the walls, the air, the very floor beneath my feet. "No," I whispered back, shaking my head, trying to deny the truth. I had escaped. I had left. I had made it out, physically. I had been outside. I had seen the sunlight, the sky. But the truth slammed into me, cold and hard. The outside was never real. It was a trick. A part of the illusion the school wove to lure its victims into the trap. The real world no longer existed for me. I was trapped forever. I backed away, my breath shallow, desperate. The walls closed in around me. The hallway grew darker, thicker, as though the very air was turning to tar, suffocating me. The figures of the lost children began to crowd around me, their voices rising, an endless chorus of whispers and wails. They were calling to me, pulling me deeper into the void. "I don't belong here," I muttered, clutching at my chest, feeling my heart race. But deep down, I knew it was too late. The school had claimed me, just as it had claimed the others before me. There was no escape from this realm. As I stumbled backward, trying to push through the darkness, a cold hand touched my shoulder. I froze. The touch was gentle, but it carried the weight of an eternity of suffering. I turned, slowly, and saw him. The boy from before. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a twisted smile crept across his face. "You're with us now," he whispered, and with those words, I felt my body begin to dissolve, to fade away, as if my very essence was being drawn into the darkness. I fought it. I screamed. I tried to hold on to the remnants of myself, of my memories, but it was futile. The darkness enveloped me, erasing everything, every thought, every feeling, until there was nothing left. Nothing but the school. And then, silence. I would never truly leave. I would never see the sun again. I would never know peace. And in this twisted school, I would wait forever for the next unfortunate soul to wander too far, to enter too deeply, to listen too carefully. And they would join us. Just as I had. The cycle would never end. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.